She spent 2 years believing the man she loved had abandoned her. He spent those same 2 years protecting her from the shadows, without ever letting her know. Sometimes the greatest act of love looks exactly like betrayal. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Dark Romance Stories channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. Rain had a way of turning New York into a mirror. From the 90th floor of the Moretti Tower, Grace Sullivan watched the city dissolve into ribbons of gold and black, the wet streets far below throwing the lights of 1,000 strangers back up at the clouds. 4 years she had lived above this city, and still it never failed to make her feel like a woman standing at the edge of something she could fall from. She pressed her palm against the cold glass. Somewhere behind her, in the vast silence of the penthouse, a clock ticked with the patience of a thing that had all the time in the world. She did not. "You're up late again," came the voice. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She knew the weight of his footsteps on marble, the way she knew her own heartbeat, measured, unhurried. A man who had never once in his life needed to rush toward anything, because everything he wanted came to him. Alessandro Moretti crossed the room in his shirt sleeves, the collar open, a glass of something amber in his hand. Even undone, he looked assembled. That was the thing about Sandro that had frightened her in the beginning and undone her later, the stillness of him. A gun could be pointed at his head, and he would ask, in that low, patient voice, whether the man holding it had considered the consequences. "I couldn't sleep," Grace said. "You never can when it rains." He stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell the cedar and smoke of him. He looked at the city, not at her. "You told me that once, the first month you were here." I remembered. She let the surprise pass over her face and away. He remembered everything. That was not tenderness, it was habit. A man in his position kept ledgers in his skull, debts, faces, weaknesses, the small hours when someone couldn't sleep. She had learned not to mistake his memory for love. "Sandro," she turned to face him at last. "I heard something today." His eyes moved to hers, dark, almost black in this light, with that unreadable quality that had made stronger people than her lose their nerve. "You hear a great many things in this house. Most of them are lies." "They said her name." Grace kept her voice even, though it cost her. "Vivian." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his face and was gone, so fast she couldn't name it. Then the stillness returned, smooth as poured concrete. "Who said it? Does it matter?" "Everything matters." He set his glass on the sill. "Names most of all." "Who said it, Grace?" She almost told him. The 2 housemaids in the east corridor, heads bent together, going quiet the second she rounded the corner, but not quiet enough. "He loved her, you know. Before. The one this new one looks like. They say she's coming back." She had stood frozen in the hallway, with a basket of folded linens in her arms, feeling the floor tilt beneath her. "It doesn't matter," Grace said again. "What matters is whether it's true. Is she coming back?" Sandro was quiet for a long time. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the harbour, distant and enormous. "Vivian Lombardi returned to New York 3 days ago," he said finally. "She requested a meeting. I have not decided whether to grant it." The words landed in Grace's chest like stones dropped into still water. She had known, some animal part of her had known from the moment she heard the whispers, and yet hearing him confirm it emptied her out completely. "3 days," she repeated. "You've known for 3 days. I don't report my movements to you." It wasn't cruel, the way he said it. That was almost worse. It was simply fact, delivered the way he delivered all facts, as though the feelings of the person hearing them were weather that would pass. "You knew what this was when you signed. When you signed. The contract. Always the contract, laid between them like a blade on a table. She would be his companion, his mistress, the woman in his bed and on his arm, and in exchange, her family's ruin would be undone. Clean terms, no promises of the heart, because the heart had never been on the table. She had signed it in a lawyer's office with her hands shaking, believing herself a woman purchasing survival with the only currency she had left. She had not planned to fall in love with him. That had not been in the contract either. "Yes," Grace said quietly. "I knew what this was." He studied her then, really looked, the way he sometimes did, as though she were a text written in a language he had almost, but not quite, learned to read. She wondered, as she often did, what he saw, whether he saw her at all, or only the ghost her face resembled. She had never seen a photograph of Vivian Lombardi, but she didn't need to. The housemaid's eyes had told her enough. She's coming back, and she looks just like you, or you look just like her. That was the cruelty at the root of everything. She had been chosen because she was a shadow. She had spent 4 years learning to love a man who had reached for her only because she reminded him of someone else. "Grace." His voice softened, or seemed to. He reached out and touched her jaw with 2 fingers, tilting her face up to the light. "Whatever you heard, whatever they told you, you are here. She is not. For now." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. "Come to bed." And God help her, she went. Because that was the shape of it. She loved him with a completeness that shamed her, and he offered her his hands and his warmth and the illusion, for a few dark hours, that she was more than a name he had never quite spoken over her body. She lay against him afterward, listening to his heartbeat, and thought, "I will lose him. It was always going to be this. I was borrowed. She has come to collect." She did not sleep. She watched the rain until the grey light of morning crept over the city, and she made herself a promise she did not yet know how she would keep. That when the collecting came, she would not humiliate herself by clinging. She would leave with her dignity, if nothing else. She did not yet know that in 3 weeks she would leave with far more than that. She did not yet know about the small, insistent flutter that had already begun, quiet as a secret, beneath her heart. Downstairs, in a rented apartment across the park, Vivian Lombardi was applying red lipstick in a gilt mirror and smiling at her own reflection. And 2,000 miles away, none of them yet knowing the game had already begun, a little white house stood empty by the California shore, waiting for a woman it had never met. Sandro granted the meeting on a Thursday. Grace knew because she was told, not by him, but by the staff, whose loyalty ran in the direction of whoever held the most fear over them, and who had decided, in the way of servants everywhere, that the returning mistress was the safer wager. All morning the house had rearranged itself around an arrival, fresh flowers in the foyer, the good crystal, a tension in the air like the held breath before a slap. Grace had considered staying in her rooms. She had considered, more seriously than she liked, walking out the front door and never returning. Instead, she came down the great curving staircase at noon, in a dove-grey dress, her chin level, because if she was to be dismissed, she would be dismissed standing up. Vivian Lombardi was in the drawing room. The housemaids had not lied. Grace stopped 3 steps from the bottom, one hand on the banister, and looked at a woman who might have been her own reflection glimpsed in a warped and older glass. The same dark hair, the same wide-set eyes, the same fine bones. But where Grace's face held something open, something that had not yet learned to lie for a living, Vivian's held everything Grace's did not. A knowing curl at the corner of the mouth, a stillness in the eyes that had nothing to do with peace. "So," Vivian said, rising from the chaise with unhurried grace, "you're the one." "I'm Grace. I know your name." Vivian crossed the room, and the closer she came, the clearer the resemblance became, and the more it curdled into something else. Like looking at a portrait that had been painted by someone who hated its subject. "He told me. Grace Sullivan, the daughter of the man who lost everything to the Castellano Bank." A smile. "How fortunate that Sandro was there to catch you." "Fortune had nothing to do with it," Grace said. Something flickered in Vivian's eyes, interest, or its imitation. "No, I don't suppose it did." She stopped a pace away and let her gaze move over Grace's face like fingers over a familiar object. "It's uncanny, isn't it? I saw the photographs and I didn't believe them, but here you are. His little copy." She said it gently, almost pityingly. "You poor thing. Do you know why he chose you?" Grace said nothing. She would not give this woman the pleasure of watching the wound open. "Because of me." Vivian's voice dropped to something confidential, sisterly, obscene. 4 years ago I left him. He was... well, you've heard the stories. He'd lost the Eastern Territories. The Castellanos were circling. The family was one bad night from collapse. I loved him. A pretty catch in her throat. God, I loved him. But I had no choice. Staying would have gotten us both killed. So I ran, and I have hated myself for it every single day since. She pressed a hand to her chest. And then he found you. A woman with my face. He built a whole little arrangement around you. Her eyes glittered. You must have wondered, in the dark, whose name he was really thinking. Get out of my way, Grace said, very quietly. Oh, sweetheart. Vivian stepped aside, with a small, mocking bow, and as Grace passed, she added, in a voice pitched just for her, I only tell you because someone should. It's kinder than letting you find out slowly. A pause. I've come home, Grace. He and I have a great deal to discuss. Grace did not run. She walked, spine straight, through the foyer and up the stairs and into her rooms. And only when the door was shut and locked did she press her back against it and slide down to the floor and let herself shake. She was still on the floor when the nausea rose, sudden, total, a wave that had nothing to do with grief. She barely reached the bathroom in time. Afterward, she knelt over the cold porcelain, gasping, and did the arithmetic she had been refusing to do for 2 weeks. The dates, the mornings, the strange new tiredness that pulled at her like an undertow. She sat back on her heels and put a hand flat against her stomach. "No," she whispered. "No, no, not now, not now." But the body kept its own ledgers, and it had already decided. That night Sandro did not come to her rooms. She lay awake and heard, or imagined she heard, the low murmur of voices in the study far below, his and hers, the woman with her face, and she pressed her hand against her belly in the dark, and made her decision in the way one makes decisions at 3 in the morning, when despair wears the mask of clarity. She would not raise a child in a house where she was a shadow. She would not let this baby grow up watching its mother be tolerated, replaced, discarded when the real woman came home. She would not fight Vivian Lombardi for a man whose heart had, she was now certain, never been hers to begin with. She would go, quietly, cleanly, before anyone could stop her. She would give the woman with her face the place she had come to reclaim, and she would take the one thing in this house that was wholly, entirely, indisputably her own. She began, that very night, to plan. 2 floors below, in the study, Sandro Moretti sat across from Vivian Lombardi with a glass of untouched whiskey before him and let her talk. He watched her weave her story, the regret, the longing, the years of exile, and he did not believe a single word of it. He had known she was coming before she knew it herself. He knew who had sent her. He knew whose bed she had warmed in the 4 years she had wept over losing his. And he sat very still, the way a man sits when he has decided to let a snake believe the field is empty, and he thought about the woman upstairs with the frightened eyes, and he thought, soon. Let them show their hand first. Then I will burn it all down around them, and she will never have to see the flames. He did not know she was already packing. In the days that followed, the house turned against Grace with the quiet efficiency of a machine built for exactly that purpose. It began small, as these things do. The flowers in her rooms stopped being changed. Her breakfast came late, or cold, or not at all. When she rang for the car, the driver was mysteriously occupied. Once, twice, a dozen times, she rounded a corner to catch the tail end of a conversation. Her name, a laugh, the particular hush of people who have been saying things they would not say to her face. She was not a fool. She knew orchestration when she saw it, but knowing the hand behind the knife does not make the knife hurt less. He kept her photograph, one of the maids said, not quite quietly enough, polishing silver in the dining room as Grace passed. For years, in the drawer of his desk. I've seen it. He never looks at this one the way he looked at her, said another, in the garden, pretending not to know Grace was on the other side of the hedge. You can tell. This one's just a stand-in, the first finished, and they both laughed, low and cruel. And Grace stood among the roses with her hand pressed to her mouth. She should have gone to Sandro. Some part of her knew that. She should have laid it all before him, the whispers, the cruelties, the campaign of small humiliations, and let him do what he did to people who displeased him. But to do that, she would have to admit how much it wounded her, and to admit that was to admit she loved him, and to admit that was to hand Vivian the final weapon. So she said nothing. She endured. And in the enduring, she became more certain than ever that she had never belonged here at all. Vivian, for her part, played the wounded lamb to perfection. In front of the staff, she was gracious to Grace, gentle, faintly pitying. The poor girl, she can't help what she is, which only sharpened the servants' contempt, because there is no cruelty like the cruelty of people flattering a rising power at the expense of a falling one. In private, when she caught Grace alone, the mask slipped. "Still here?" she murmured once, passing Grace on the stairs. "You have more endurance than I gave you credit for." Or less pride. A smile. "Don't worry, it won't be much longer." Grace said nothing. She had learned that silence cost Vivian more than any answer could. But that night she was sick again, twice, and she lay curled on the bathroom floor with her cheek against the cool marble, and understood that she could not do this, not for months, not with a child growing inside her, drinking the poison of her days. She thought of her mother, dead these 6 years, and what she would have said. A woman's dignity, Gracie, is the one thing no one can take. You have to give it away. She would not give it away. Not to this house, not to that woman, not to a man who had never once said her name as though it were the only name in the world. She began to gather her things, not all of them, only what would fit in a single case, only what would not be missed. Cash she had saved from the allowance he insisted on giving her, an allowance she had never touched, tucked away in the lining of a coat. A little jewellery she could sell. Her passport. She researched, on the phone she was careful to keep clean, small towns on distant coasts, places where a woman with dark hair and a haunted face could disappear and begin again. And through it all, in the strange way of the human heart, she loved him more, not less, because now that she was leaving, she let herself look at him openly, at breakfast, across a room, in the half-light of the rare evenings he still came to her, and memorize him. The way he held a glass, the scar at his hairline she had never asked about, the rare, private smile that broke over his face, perhaps once a month, unguarded, that she had spent 4 years learning to earn, and would now never see again. One evening he came to her rooms and found her at the window, and he stood in the doorway a long moment before he spoke. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I've been tired." "You've lost weight." He crossed to her, took her chin in his hand, turned her face toward the lamp. His eyes moved over her with an attention that undid her every time. "You're pale. Are you ill?" "I'm fine, Sandro." "Don't lie to me." Sharper now. "Not you. Everyone in this house lies to me. Not you." His thumb moved along her jaw. "Tell me who's been troubling you, and I'll deal with it." For one wild moment, she almost told him everything. Vivian, the maids, the whispers, the baby, all of it. She looked up into his dark, unreadable face, and she saw, or thought she saw, something there that might have been tenderness, and her heart leapt toward it like a fool. Then, from the hall below, a laugh. Her laugh, bright and proprietary, and a voice, Sandro's man, Renzo, saying, "Signorina Lombardi, the Don asked me to bring you the—" And the moment shattered. Grace pulled her face from his hand. "There's nothing to tell," she said. "I'm just tired. Please, I'd like to sleep." He studied her for a long, dangerous moment. Then, to her surprise, he stepped back. As you like. At the door he paused. Grace? She looked up. Something worked behind his eyes, some sentence he did not, in the end, say. Rest, was all it became, and he was gone. She stood at the window for a long time after. Then she took the coat with the money in its lining out of the wardrobe and laid it across the case. And she knew that she would go before the week was out. It rained that night. It seemed to her that it was always raining now. She chose a Tuesday because on Tuesdays Sandro's schedule took him downtown to the club he owned in the meatpacking district, Elysium, all black glass and gold light, where the family's real business was conducted in rooms the dancers never saw. And he did not return until the small hours. She chose the rain because the rain covered a great many things. Footsteps, engines, the sound of a woman crying. She wrote him a letter. She wrote it 7 times and burned 6 of them. The 7th she left on the pillow, and it said only what she could bear to say, and nothing of what she could not. Sandro, you gave me more than the contract promised. I am giving back what was never really mine to hold. She's home now, and I know what that means. Don't look for me. Let this be the one clean thing between us. G. She did not write, I love you. She did not write, I am carrying your child. Some truths you keep for yourself, because they are the only things that are yours. At 11:30 she went down the service stairs with a single case and the coat over her arm. The house was quiet. She had chosen her hour well. The night guard at the service entrance was a young man named Tommaso, who had a soft spot for her because she had once brought him coffee on a freezing night when everyone else had walked past. And when he saw her, he stood up straight, alarmed. Signorina Grace, it's late. Where? I couldn't sleep, Tommaso. I want to walk, just to the corner and back. He glanced at the case in her hand. She saw the calculation move across his young face, his orders, his fondness, the rain, the hour. I should call the car, he said uncertainly. No cars. She smiled, and it took everything she had. Please, I just need air. I feel like a bird in a cage in there. You know how it is. She touched his arm. It's our secret. I'll be back before anyone's the wiser. He should not have let her. He knew it even then. He would know it more sharply later, in a small, windowless room, explaining to a man with terrible, patient eyes exactly how he had let the Don's woman walk out into the rain. But he was young, and she was kind, and the world had not yet taught him what it costs to be kind to the wrong person at the wrong moment. 10 minutes, he said. Then I'm coming to find you. 10 minutes, she agreed, and stepped out into the rain. She did not go to the corner. She went to the parking structure 2 blocks east, where, that afternoon, using cash and a false name, she had left a plain grey sedan. She threw the case in the back and sat for a moment behind the wheel, with the rain drumming on the roof and her whole body shaking. And she thought, if I start this car, there is no going back. He will never forgive it. Whatever we were, it ends here. She started the car. She drove out of the city with her hands white on the wheel and the wipers beating and the great lit towers of Manhattan sliding away behind her in the mirror. Somewhere in one of them, a woman with her face was laughing in a warm room. Somewhere downtown, in a room of black glass, a man she loved was doing the cold arithmetic of power, not yet knowing that the one warm thing in his life was driving west into the dark. She cried until she couldn't see, And then she pulled over on the shoulder of the turnpike and put both hands on the wheel and her forehead on her hands and wept until there was nothing left. And then she wiped her face and drove on. At the tower, 10 minutes came and went. Tommaso went out into the rain and walked to the corner and back and did not find her. He walked to the next corner. Then, cold with a fear that had nothing to do with the weather, he called Renzo. Renzo called the club. At Elysium, in a room above the dance floor, Sandro Moretti was told that the Sullivan woman had left the tower on foot at 11:30 and had not returned. He set down his glass. He did not raise his voice. That was the terrifying thing about him. The worse it was, the quieter he became. "Where?" he said. "We don't know, boss. Tommaso says she wanted air. She had a case." He thought, a case. Something moved through Sandro's face and was gone. She took a case. He was already standing, already moving. By the time he reached the street, the car was waiting, and he sat in the back, with his phone in his hand, and his jaw like stone. And he made calls, and calls were made, and the vast, quiet machinery of the Moretti family turned its attention to the finding of one woman in the rain. They found the letter at 1 in the morning. Renzo brought it to him in the study, and Sandro read it once, twice, and then sat very still with the paper in his hands for a long time. "She's home now, and I know what that means." He understood then what Vivian had done. The whispers, the maids, the slow poisoning of the one clean thing. He had thought he was watching the game. He had not seen that they had reached past him, to her, and turned his own silence into a weapon against him. "Boss," Renzo said carefully, "do we bring her back?" Sandro looked at the letter. "Don't look for me. Let this be the one clean thing between us." And here was the mistake that 4 years and a great deal of blood would be required to undo. Because Sandro Moretti, who understood power and patience and the long game better than any man alive, understood the human heart hardly at all. He thought, the family is a battlefield now. Vivian is Marco's blade, and the purge is coming, and there will be blood on these floors before it's done. If I bring her back, she'll be in the middle of it. They'll use her against me. They'll hurt her to hurt me. She'll be safer out there, thinking herself free, than in here beside me. It was the reasoning of a man who had decided that love was best served by distance. It was, in its cold way, a kind of devotion. It was also the cruelest thing he ever did to her. "No," he said, "don't bring her back." He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket, over his heart, where it would stay. "Find her. Watch her. Whoever she goes to, wherever she lands, I want eyes on her day and night. She is not to be touched. She is not to be frightened. She is not to know." He looked up, and his eyes were terrible. "If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will hold every one of you responsible. Do you understand me?" "Yes, boss." "Go." And so it began. The 4 years of protection she never knew she had, the guardian angels in plain cars on quiet streets, the invisible hand that kept the coast around a little white house always, somehow, safe. Grace drove west, believing she had escaped. She had only exchanged one cage for a larger, gentler, invisible one, built by a man who did not know how to say, "Stay," and so said, "I will keep you safe from a distance," instead. The rain followed her all the way to the Mississippi before it finally, mercifully, stopped. To understand how a woman comes to sign herself away, you must go back, past the rain, past Vivian's return, past the 4 good years, to the night the Sullivans lost everything. Grace's father, Thomas Sullivan, had built a mid-sized development firm out of nothing but nerve and a good name, and for 30 years the name had been enough. Sullivan Development put up towers, brought partners to the table, borrowed against tomorrow the way all such firms do. And then, over the course of a single terrible autumn, tomorrow stopped coming. It happened the way these things always happen, not all at once, but all at once. A loan called in early, a partner who withdrew without warning, a bank, the Castellano Bank, that had been so eager to lend, suddenly so eager to collect. And behind the bank, though the Sullivans did not know it then, a hand they would never have suspected. Credit lines vanished overnight. Suppliers demanded cash. The towers stood half-built and bleeding money, and the vultures, sensing weakness, wheeled in from every direction. Grace was 24 that year, working in her father's office, learning the business she had always assumed would one day be partly hers. She watched her father age a decade in 3 months. She watched her mother's china sold, then her mother's jewellery, then the house on Long Island that had been in the family for 2 generations. She sat in meetings where men in good suits explained, with terrible courtesy, exactly how thoroughly the Sullivans were finished. "It's not bad luck," her father said one night, grey-faced, staring at a wall of unpaid invoices. "Bad luck doesn't move like this. Someone's doing this to us. Someone with reach." He laughed, an awful sound. "But who? We're nobody. We're not worth destroying." He was wrong about that, though he would not learn why for years. The Sullivans were not being destroyed for who they were. They were being destroyed for whose face a daughter happened to wear. But that thread ran into a darkness none of them could yet see. By December, the firm was in receivership, and the debts had names attached. And the names were not the kind you go to the police about. The Castellano Bank had sold the Sullivan paper, quietly, at a steep discount, to a buyer who did not advertise. And one cold morning, a car came to the modest apartment the family had retreated to, and a man in a dark coat came to the door, and he was very polite, and he said that his employer wished to discuss the matter of the Sullivan debts, and that it would be wise to come. Thomas Sullivan was too broken to go. Grace's brother was a boy of 19, useless with terror. So Grace went, 24 years old, in her one good coat, with her chin up and her heart a fist of ice. She got into the dark car and let it carry her into Manhattan and up, into a tower of black glass, to a floor where the whole roaring city lay spread beneath the windows like something conquered. And there, for the first time, she saw Alessandro Moretti. He was standing at the window with his back to her when she came in, and even then, even in her fear, she registered the stillness of him, a man who did not turn at the sound of a door, because nothing that came through a door had ever been a threat to him. When he did turn, she felt it like a physical thing, the weight of his attention settling over her. And she watched his face change. She did not understand it then. She thought, in her rawness, that she had somehow displeased him, so strange was the look that crossed his features. A jolt, quickly mastered, a stillness that went suddenly deeper. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he had believed lost. She did not know it was because her face was a knife driven straight into an old wound. She did not know that 4 years earlier, a woman with that exact face had walked out of his life at the lowest moment of it, and that he had spent every day since building himself back into a fortress, and that here, now, delivered to him by the machinery of debt, was that face again, younger, softer, frightened, alive. "Sit," he said. She sat. He came around the desk and looked at the file that lay upon it. Her father's ruin, reduced to paper. "Sullivan Development," he said. "You know how much your family owes." "To the dollar," Grace said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "And how do you propose to pay it?" "I don't." She met his eyes, though it cost her everything. "I can't. You know I can't. That's why you had me brought here, isn't it? To watch me understand that I can't. So let's not pretend. My father is a good man who trusted the wrong people. My mother is dead. My brother is a child. Whatever you're going to take it, but leave them something to live on. Please." Her voice cracked on the last word, one hairline fracture in the ice, and a single tear escaped and slid down her cheek before she could stop it. And she hated it, hated the weakness of it. And she lifted her chin higher and did not look away and did not stop fighting for the people she loved. She did not see the effect of that tear. She could not have. But something happened in Alessandro Moretti in that moment, some final, silent thing, a lock turning in a door that had been rusted shut for 4 years. He would tell her, much later, that he had loved her from that first tear, that he had looked at a girl who wept and fought at the same time, who begged and defied in the same breath, and had understood that this was not the woman who had abandoned him at all, only her mirror image, and that the mirror image was worth 100 of the original. But he told her none of that then. He was a careful man. He had learned what love cost. So he did the only thing a man like him knew how to do with a thing he wanted and could not risk wanting. He built a cage around it and called the cage a contract. "There's another way," he said. "Sit still and listen, and I'll tell you how your family walks out of this alive." And Grace, who thought she had reached the bottom of the world, leaned forward to hear how much further down it went. The terms, when he laid them out, were so simple and so monstrous that at first she thought she had misheard. "You'll come and live under my protection," Sandro said. He had returned to his side of the desk. The city burned below them, gold and endless. "You'll be my companion, publicly. You'll appear where I appear. You'll be seen where I'm seen, and everyone in this city and beyond it will understand that you belong to me." He said belong without heat, the way one states a boundary line. In exchange, the Sullivan debts disappear, all of them, tonight. Your father's name is cleared, your family is made whole. Grace sat very still. "Companion," she said, "you mean—" "I mean what you think I mean." His eyes did not leave her face. "I won't insult you by dressing it up. You'd share my life, my home, my bed, if and when you chose to. That part is not in the contract, and I want you to hear that clearly. I don't take what isn't given. But the appearance of it is not optional. The world has to believe it's real." "Why?" The word came out of her before she could stop it. "Why would you? I'm nobody. You could have any woman in this city. Why buy a bankrupt stranger?" For a long moment, he said nothing. She would understand, years later, what she had asked and how impossible it was for him to answer. Because you have her face and none of her poison. Because I looked at you and I wanted, for the first time in 4 years, to keep something. Because I would rather own your survival than watch you sold off to my enemies, who would use you against me the moment they learned your name. What he said was, "My reasons are my own." That's not an answer. It's the only one you'll get. He slid a folder across the desk. The debts are real. The offer is real, and it expires when you walk out that door. You can go home to your father and tell him you refused, and watch what happens to your family over the next 6 months. Or you can sign and end it tonight. He leaned back. I'm not a patient man about most things. About this, I'll give you an hour. She did not need an hour. She thought of her father's grey face, her brother's terror, the house already gone, the china already sold, the future already foreclosed. She thought of every person she loved, standing at the edge of a ruin she alone had been given the power to reverse. And she understood that dignity, in the end, was a luxury of the solvent, and that she was not solvent, and that some prices you pay because the alternative is watching the people you love pay them instead. Give me the pen, she said. He gave her the pen. And as she signed, Grace Elizabeth Sullivan, in a hand that shook only a little, she made herself a private vow that she would keep for 4 years. I will honour this bargain, and I will never, ever let him see that it costs me anything. He has bought my presence. He has not bought my heart, and he never will. She kept the first half of that vow. She broke the second within the year, and never told him. The debts vanished, as promised, overnight. Her father, when he learned what she had done, wept and raged and tried to forbid it, and then, in the end, because he was a man and afraid and out of options, let it happen, and hated himself, and hated Sandro, and loved his daughter with a helpless, shamed devotion that never quite recovered. Grace moved into the tower with 2 suitcases and the vow, and began her strange new life as the woman who belonged to Alessandro Moretti. It was not what she had feared. That was the thing that undid her in the end. He did not touch her, not for a long time. He gave her rooms of her own, beautiful rooms, and an allowance she didn't touch, and a freedom within the gilded walls that surprised her. He was cold, yes, cold to the world, cold to his men, cold in a way that could frost a room. But to her he was something stranger, watchful, careful. He learned her habits. He noticed when she didn't eat. He remembered, off-handedly, things she had mentioned once and forgotten. The flowers she liked, the music, the fact that she couldn't sleep in the rain. He filled her rooms with white roses and never once said he'd done it. And slowly, slowly, she watched him do something she had not bargained for. He began, quietly, to lift her family up. Not just clear the debts, that had been the contract, but more. A word placed in the right ear, and her father's blacklisted name was suddenly welcome again in rooms that had shut against it. A contract steered without fanfare toward a firm her brother had joined. A loan on impossibly gentle terms from a bank that answered to Moretti money, so that Sullivan Development, smaller now, humbler, but alive, began to build again. None of it announced, none of it credited. She only pieced it together over months, watching her father come back to life 2,000 miles away, hearing the strength return to his voice on the phone, and understanding at last that the man who owned her was, in secret, rebuilding the very family he could have crushed. She asked him about it once, only once. "Why are you helping them?" They were on the terrace, late, the city glittering. The contract only said the debts. "You've done so much more. Why?" He didn't look at her. He looked at the city, and after a long silence he said, in a voice she had never heard him use, low and almost rough, "Because it matters to you." That was all. Because it matters to you. 4 words, and he never explained them, and turned the conversation and went inside. But Grace stood on the terrace with her heart cracking open like ice in spring, and she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that the second half of her vow was already lost, that she loved him, that she had, perhaps, loved him a little from that first day when a cold and terrible man had looked at a weeping girl and offered her, in the only language he knew, a way to save everyone she loved. She loved him, and she never dared to say it, and that failure of nerve would one day drive her out into the rain. They were good, the years between. She would remember them, later, in the little house by the sea, remember them so vividly it hurt, turning them over like stones warmed by the sun. There was the first time he touched her. It was not on the night she signed, nor the next, nor for many months after. It came on an ordinary evening in her second winter in the tower, when a rival had made a move against the family, and the house had been full of tension and armed men for a week, and she had waited up for him, unable to sleep, and he had come in near dawn with blood on his cuff that was not his own, and a look on his face like a man walking back from a war. She had gone to him without thinking, crossed the room and taken his hand, and looked at the blood, and then up at his face, and something in her chest had simply broken open, and she had said, not planned it, just said it, "You're home. You're all right. Thank God." And he had looked at her, this cold and dangerous man, as though no one had waited up for him in a very long time, as though the words, "You're home," had struck him somewhere no bullet ever had. "Grace," he said, just her name. And then he had kissed her, and it had been nothing like the transaction she had braced herself for on the night she signed. It had been a man reaching, in the dark, for the one warm thing in a cold world. And it had been her reaching back. And whatever the contract said, there was nothing bought or sold in it at all. After that, they were, in every way that the contract had left optional, real. She moved her things into his rooms. She learned the topography of him, the scar at his hairline, a bottle, a boyhood fight in Naples, he told her once, the only piece of his childhood he ever gave her. The old bullet wound below his ribs, the particular tension in his shoulders that meant a bad day among his men. She learned that he slept badly and woke without a sound, instantly alert, and that if she woke first and lay still against him, he would, sometimes, sleep an hour longer. She counted those hours as her greatest achievements. He was not soft. Let no one imagine he became soft. He remained to the world exactly what he was, the Don of the Moretti family, a man whose displeasure ended careers and, occasionally, lives, a man who ran an empire of clubs and construction and darker things beneath the shining city, and who ran it with a patience and a ruthlessness that made even his enemies careful. She saw that side of him too. She saw the door close on his face when business walked in. She learned which rooms to leave, which calls not to overhear. She never asked what she didn't want to know. Some nights the tower filled with hard-eyed men and low voices, and she stayed in their rooms and read, and did not ask in the morning why one of the men who had been there was suddenly never mentioned again. She told herself she could live with the darkness because she never had to look directly at it. She was wrong about that, but the wrongness was years away. What she could not live with, what she never quite made peace with in all those good years, was the silence at the centre of him. Because for all their closeness, there were things he never said. He never said, "I love you." He never said why he'd chosen her. He never once spoke the name Vivian, though Grace learned it in fragments, a name the older men used and then cut off when they saw her, a name attached to a photograph she was never meant to see, a name that hung over the household like the ghost of a woman she was somehow standing in for. And so even in the good years, even lying in his arms in the small hours, with her heart full to breaking, a thin, cold thread of doubt ran through her like a fault line through stone. He reaches for me in the dark. But whose face does he see? He never says my name when he wants me most. He says nothing at all. Am I Grace to him, or am I the shape of someone he lost? She never asked. She was afraid of the answer, and in the not asking, she left the door open through which Vivian Lombardi would one day walk. There was one moment, she returned to it endlessly afterward, that should have told her everything. A summer night on the terrace, both of them a little loose with wine, the city humming below. She had been braver than usual. She had said, half teasing, half terrified, "Sandro, if she came back. The woman before me. The one I'm not supposed to know about. What would you do?" He had gone very still, the kind of still that meant she had walked too close to something. "She's not coming back," he said. But if she did? He turned and looked at her, and his face in the low light was unreadable, and he said, slowly, as though choosing each word from a locked box, "If she came back, it would be because someone sent her, and I would want to know who." A pause. "It would have nothing to do with love, Grace. That died a long time ago. Whatever comes back wearing her face, it won't be love." She had heard the wrong thing. She had heard that died a long time ago, and let it comfort her, and missed entirely the harder truth buried in it. Whatever comes back wearing her face won't be love. It will be a move on a board. She had thought he was reassuring her about his heart. He was warning her about a war. She only understood years later that he had told her the truth that night, the whole truth, and she had been too frightened of the surface of it to hear the depth. That died a long time ago. She held those words like a talisman for 2 more years, and then, on a rainy Thursday, a woman with Grace's face walked back into the house, wearing the smile of a victim and carrying in her painted hands the beginning of the end. Grace drove for 6 days. She drove until New York was a bruise on the far side of the country, until the flat grey winter of the east gave way to the pale gold light of the west, until the land ran out entirely and there was nothing left in front of her but the Pacific, enormous and indifferent, throwing itself against the rocks below a 2-lane road. She stopped in a town too small to be on most maps, a scatter of houses along a curve of coast, a general store, a diner, a church, a harbour where a dozen fishing boats knocked against the docks. She had money enough, if she was careful, for a year, maybe 2. She found a little white house at the end of a lane, weathered and salt-stung, with a porch that faced a water and a garden gone to seed, and she rented it from an old woman named Mrs. Delgado, who asked no questions beyond whether Grace could pay, and who, when she saw the particular haunted quality of the young woman's face, quietly knocked 10% off the rent and never mentioned it. Grace did not know, could not have known, that within a week of her arrival, a man in an unremarkable car had rented a cottage half a mile up the coast, and that he was one of 3 who would rotate through it over the coming years, and that they answered to a number that answered to New York. She did not know that the reason the town felt so safe, so gently sealed off from the world, was that a great deal of quiet money had made certain it stayed that way. She thought she had found a hiding place. She had been placed in a sanctuary. She was 10 weeks along when she arrived. She found a doctor 2 towns over, a kind woman near retirement, and she said her husband had died. The lie came easier than the truth, and the doctor was gentle with her and confirmed what her body had already told her. A healthy pregnancy. A due date in the summer. The first months were the hardest. Not the body. The body adjusted, swelled, ripened, did its ancient work without asking her permission. It was the nights. She would lie in the little white house with the sea breathing outside the window and reach, half asleep, for a warmth that wasn't there, and wake fully to the cold and the dark and the enormous fact of what she had done. She had left him. She had taken his child and left, and he did not know, and he would never know, and someday this baby would ask about its father, and she would have to decide what lie to tell. She grieved him like a death. Some mornings she woke, and for one merciful second forgot, and then remembered, and the remembering was a fresh wound each time. She missed him with a completeness that frightened her. Not the tower, not the wealth, not the life, but him, the weight of him in the dark, the rare private smile, the 4 words on the terrace. Because it matters to you. She turned those words over until they were smooth. She wondered if he had noticed she was gone. She imagined him with Vivian, in the rooms that had been theirs, and made herself stop imagining, because that way lay madness. And then, slowly, the sea did its work. It was impossible to stay entirely broken by that water. It was too old and too vast, and too utterly unconcerned with the sorrows of one young woman. She walked the beach every morning, growing rounder, and the wind scoured something out of her. She began to sleep. She began, tentatively, to garden, to pull the weeds from Mrs. Delgado's neglected beds, and put in her hands and coax something living out of the salt, poor soil. Tomatoes first, then herbs, then, because she could not help herself, flowers. And it was the flowers that saved her in the end. The stubborn insistence of green things on blooming, even here, even at the lonely edge of the world. She made a friend or two. Mrs. Delgado, who brought her soup and did not pry. The doctor. A woman at the diner named Rosa, who had also, it emerged, once run from something, and who understood without needing to be told. The town folded gently around the pregnant widow at the end of the lane, and asked nothing, and gave what it could. And Grace, who had lived 4 years in a golden tower, surrounded by people who watched her for signs of weakness, wept the first time Rosa left a pie on her porch, for no reason at all. Her daughter was born in July, in the small hospital 2 towns over, with Rosa holding her hand because there was no one else. She named her Isabella, for no reason she could have explained, except that it was a name that belonged to no one from before, a clean name, a name that was hers and the baby's alone. Isabella Sullivan, 7 pounds, a shock of dark hair, and eyes that even the nurses remarked on, dark, almost black, watchful even in infancy, the eyes of a man 2,000 miles away who did not know he had a daughter. Grace held her in the grey dawn and wept, and this time the weeping was not all grief. There was something else in it, something fierce and new. She looked down at the small, dark face and made a third vow, and this one she would keep with everything she had. You will never wonder if you are loved. You will never be anyone's shadow. Whatever I lost, whatever I ran from, you will have all of me. And it will be enough. I will make it enough. Half a mile up the coast, a man in an unremarkable car photographed the mother and child leaving the hospital and sent the photograph, encrypted, to a private number in New York. And in a study high above the city, Alessandro Moretti opened the image and looked at it for a very long time. He did not know he had a daughter until that moment. He had ordered his men to watch, to protect, to never intrude, and they had done exactly that, so completely that even the pregnancy had been reported only as the woman appears unwell, possibly ill. No one had wanted to be the one to speculate, and so the truth arrived all at once, in a single photograph. Grace, thinner and browner, and somehow more beautiful than he remembered, coming down the hospital steps into the July sun with a bundle in her arms. Sandro Moretti looked at the photograph of his daughter, and for the first time in a great many years, the coldest man in New York put his face in his hands. And then, because he was who he did not get on a plane. He did not go to her. He looked at the photograph, and then he looked at the reports on his desk, the ones about Marco, about Vivian, about the war that was coming to his house, and he made again the same terrible, loving calculation he had made in the rain. Not yet. Not while they could reach her. Not while there's a single knife in this family that could be turned toward that child. First, I burn it down. First, I make the world safe. Then, only then, I go to the sea. He set the photograph in the drawer of his desk, beside the folded letter that still smelled faintly of her. And he began, in earnest, to plan the destruction of everyone who had made this necessary. To understand the war Sandro was planning, you must understand Marco Moretti. And to understand Marco, you must understand what it is to be born just close enough to a throne to want it, and just far enough away to never quite touch it. Marco was Sandro's cousin, the son of the elder Moretti brother who had died young, passed over by the family's old men in favour of Sandro's line. He had grown up in the great houses, at the edges of the family's councils, close enough to smell the power, and forbidden, always, from holding it. He was clever, cleverer than Sandro in some ways, quicker with a lie, better at the smiling half of the business, the part that happened in daylight over handshakes. And he had spent his entire adult life nursing a grievance that had curdled over the years into something patient and cold and absolutely without loyalty. He had made his first move 4 years earlier, at the family's lowest ebb, when the eastern territories were lost, when the Castellanos were circling, when it seemed for one long winter that the house of Moretti might fall entirely. Marco had looked at his cousin, bleeding and cornered, and decided that the time had come. He had not moved openly, that was not his way. Instead, he had turned to the one person closest to Sandro's heart, a woman named Vivian Lombardi, beautiful and hungry, and no more loyal than Marco himself. And he had whispered to her the thing she most wanted to hear. "He's finished. The family's finished. Why go down with a sinking man? Come with me. When it's over, I'll be the one standing, and you'll be beside me." And Vivian, calculating the odds, had believed him. She had made the wrong bet. That was the thing she would never forgive. Not Sandro's coldness, not Marco's eventual indifference, but her own miscalculation. Because Sandro Moretti did not fall. She had left him in the winter, slipping away to Europe with a story about family in Milan, taking with her a few of the family's smaller secrets as a parting gift to her new master. And she had waited in the pretty apartments Marco kept for her in Rome and Geneva for the news that the house of Moretti had collapsed and her new life had begun. The news never came. Instead, impossibly, infuriatingly, Sandro rose. Cornered, betrayed, abandoned, he had done what cornered men of his particular kind do. He had become something colder and harder than he had ever been. He had made a truce with the Castellanos on terms that cost him blood, but bought him time. He had cut away the parts of the family that were bleeding him and cauterized the wounds without anesthetic. He had taken back the eastern territories one street at a time over 3 brutal years, and he had done it so thoroughly, so patiently, so without mercy, that by the 4th year the house of Moretti stood taller and darker and more feared than it ever had before he fell. And Marco, watching from the wings, understood that his window had closed, and set about, with the patience of a truly dangerous man, prying it open again. He had spent the 4 years making himself indispensable. He handled the family's legitimate face, the construction firms, the real estate, the political connections. He was charming. He was useful. He was, on the surface, the loyal cousin who had stayed. And beneath the surface, he built, patiently, a faction. Men who felt overlooked, men who resented Sandro's coldness, men who could be bought or flattered or frightened into believing that the family would be better served by a warmer hand at the tiller. He gathered them slowly, one grievance at a time, and he waited for a weakness. And then he found one. He found her. Marco had known about Grace Sullivan for years. Everyone in the family knew the Don kept a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to the one who had betrayed him. Most read it as a strange grief, a rich man's private wound. Marco read it differently. Marco, who had held Vivian in his own arms and knew exactly what that face could do, looked at the situation and saw a lever. Because here was the thing Marco understood that no one else did. Sandro's coldness was a performance. Marco had watched his cousin his whole life, and he had seen the one crack in the granite. The way Sandro's eyes moved when Grace entered a room, the way the household orbited around her comfort, the fortune quietly spent rebuilding a bankrupt family 2,000 miles away. Sandro loved her with the whole of a heart he pretended not to have. And a man who loves is a man who can be reached. So Marco went to Vivian. She was older now, harder, her beauty sharpened to a weapon by 4 years of disappointed ambition. Marco found her in Geneva, in an apartment whose rent he had grown tired of paying, and he laid out his second offer as carefully as he had laid out his first. "He's going to fall," Marco said. "I've spent 4 years making sure of it. But I need a way in. I need someone close to him, someone he'd never suspect. Someone who can find the things I need, the account structures, the names of his silent partners, the routes, the leverage. And I need him distracted, off balance, grieving." He smiled. "There's a woman living in his house who looks exactly like you." Vivian, who had learned nothing from her first miscalculation, made her second. "And when it's done," she asked, "when you're standing where he stands?" "Then you'll be beside me," Marco said, as he had said before in almost exactly those words. This time, for real. He was lying, of course. He had no intention of keeping Vivian past her usefulness, but she wanted to believe it, and people who want to believe a thing are the easiest people in the world to deceive. So Vivian came home to New York, wearing the smile of a victim and a story of noble sacrifice. "Leaving you back then, I had no choice. I did it to keep us both alive." She wept prettily. She played the woman who had lost everything for love. And she set about, methodically, doing exactly what Marco had sent her to do. To get close, to seduce her way back into Sandro's confidence, to steal the secrets that would let Marco strike, and, as a bonus that pleased her cruel heart, to break the spirit of the young woman who had taken her place. She was good at it. The whispers among the housemaids, the slow poisoning of Grace's days, the careful, surgical destruction of a rival's confidence. All of it was Vivian's craft, and she practiced it with relish. And she succeeded so completely that within 3 weeks the young woman had fled into the rain, which Vivian counted as the sweetest victory of all. What Vivian did not know, what Marco did not know, was that Sandro Moretti had understood everything from the very first day. He had known Vivian was coming before her plane touched down, because Sandro Moretti had spent 4 years building a network of eyes and ears so complete that a serpent could not enter his garden without his knowing. He had known who sent her. He had known from the pattern of Marco's movements, from the faction quietly assembling in the shadows, from a dozen small betrayals catalogued and filed away, that his cousin was building toward a strike, and that Vivian was the opening move. And so he had done the most dangerous thing a hunted man can do. He had let the trap be set. He had granted Vivian her meeting. He had let her believe she was deceiving him. He had watched her work her poison through his house, gathering the evidence he would need, letting Marco's faction show itself thread by thread, so that when he finally moved, he could cut out the entire cancer in a single stroke, rather than chasing its roots for years. It was a good plan. It was a cold, patient, ruthless plan, worthy of the man who had clawed an empire back from ruin. It had one flaw. It had never accounted for the possibility that Vivian's poison would work faster on Grace than his purge could work on Marco, that the young woman he was trying to protect would break and flee before he could make the world safe for her. He had been watching the serpent so closely that he had failed to watch the one thing that mattered most. By the time he understood his mistake, she was already gone into the rain, carrying his child, and the only thing left to do was to finish what he had started, and pray that when the burning was done, there would still be something at the lonely shore worth going back to. The morning after Grace left, Vivian Lombardi came down to breakfast, expecting to find a household in mourning and a Don in disarray. She found neither. Sandro was at the head of the long table, immaculate, reading the financial pages, a cup of black coffee at his elbow. He did not look up when she entered. He did not look like a man whose mistress had vanished into the night. He looked like a man for whom nothing had happened at all. "Good morning," Vivian said, sliding into a chair. She had chosen her dress with care, something soft, something that made her look younger, more vulnerable. "I heard there was some excitement last night. The girl, she left?" "She did." Sandro turned a page. "I'm so sorry." Vivian arranged her face into sympathy. "That must be painful. Though," a delicate pause, "perhaps it's for the best. She never really understood this world, not the way I did." Sandro set down the paper and looked at her, and for one cold instant Vivian felt something she had not expected to feel, a flicker of fear, quickly buried, because his eyes, when they met hers, were not the eyes of a grieving man. They were the eyes of a man appraising an asset. "Perhaps," he said, and he smiled, a thing so rare that Vivian, who had once known him well, felt the wrongness of it in her spine. "Sit with me, Vivian. It's been 4 years. Tell me about Europe." And so began the long game. For weeks, Sandro let Vivian believe she was winning. He let her back into the edges of his life, dinners, appearances, the occasional evening that she read as tenderness and he conducted as reconnaissance. He let her see certain things, account statements left where she would find them, conversations she was allowed to overhear, meetings she was permitted to know about. He fed her, carefully, a diet of information that was 90% true and 10% poison. Real enough that Marco would trust it, false in exactly the places that would, when the time came, lead Marco's men into a room from which they would not walk out. He watched her copy documents she thought were secret. He watched her slip out to meetings she thought were unobserved. Every name she passed to Marco, every route she compromised, every secret she stole, Sandro knew, because Sandro had chosen which secrets to leave lying around, and every one of them was a thread that led, eventually, back to Marco's hand. It was, in its way, a masterpiece of patience. But it cost him. It cost him in the small hours, when the house was quiet and he sat alone in the study with the drawer open and the photograph in his hand. Grace on the hospital steps, the July sun, the bundle in her arms. It cost him every time Vivian smiled at him with Grace's face, and he had to smile back, had to let a woman he despised wear the features of the woman he loved, had to sit across the table from a cruel imitation of the one thing he wanted and pretend to be seduced by it. Renzo, who had served him for 15 years and knew him better than anyone living, said to him once, quietly, in the garage before dawn, "Boss, you don't have to do it like this. We could take Marco tonight, take them all, be done." "No," Sandro said. "She's alone out there with—" Renzo stopped. He was one of only 3 men who knew about the child. "With the baby. Every day you wait. Every day I wait, the safer she is when I go to her." Sandro's voice was flat, final. "If I move too soon and miss even one of them, one man, one account, one loyalty I didn't see, then it never ends. It follows us. It follows her. It follows the child for the rest of their lives. Do you understand?" He turned, and his face in the grey light was tighter with restraint. "I'm not doing this to win, Renzo. I'm doing it so there's nothing left, so no one ever can use them against me again. I only get to do this once. It has to be complete." Renzo said nothing. But he understood then the shape of his master's love, that it was not soft, and it was not warm, and it did not fly across the country and the night, but that it was, in its cold and patient way, more total than any love he had ever seen. Sandro Moretti was building a scorched earth so that his family could live in the green that grew after. It was monstrous, and it was devoted, and it was, Renzo thought, probably going to break the heart of the woman it was meant to protect, because women did not want to be protected by absence. But that was not a thing Renzo could say to a don. So he said nothing, and drove. The reports from California came weekly. Sandro read every one. The subject is well, the subject gardens. The child is healthy, feeding, growing, dark hair, dark eyes. He learned his daughter's life in fragments, in the flat prose of surveillance reports, and it was the strangest torture he had ever endured. To know the exact weight of a child he had never held, to be told she had smiled for the first time, and to read it in a report filed by a man in a parked car half a mile away. Once, only once, he nearly broke. A report came that said the child had been ill, a fever. The subject had taken her to the hospital in the night, for 11 hours, until the follow-up came, fever broken, child well, mother exhausted but calm. Sandro Moretti sat in his study and did not move and did not speak. And Renzo stood outside the door and would not let anyone enter, because he had seen his master's face and knew that whatever was behind that door was not for other eyes. The child recovered. Sandro sent, anonymously, through 3 intermediaries, a specialist to the town, a paediatrician who happened to relocate his practice there, whose fees were unusually reasonable, and who never knew who had paid to place him within 20 minutes of a little white house at the end of a lane. Grace thought the town simply lucky in its new doctor. She did not know that her daughter's health had become, for a man 2,000 miles away, the most closely guarded interest of a criminal empire. He loved them across the distance with everything he had. And neither of them knew, and the not knowing was the price he had chosen to pay. He told himself it was worth it. He told himself that when it was done, when Marco was ash and Vivian was gone, and the world was finally completely safe, he would go to the sea and confess everything, and she would understand. He was wrong about that last part. She would not simply understand. First, she would be furious. First, she would look at him across the porch of a little white house and demand to know how he could have known where she was for 4 years and never come, never called, never told her she was not alone. First, he would have to reckon with the fact that his kind of love and her kind of love were not the same shape, and that the distance he had built as a fortress she had lived in as a grief. But that reckoning was still to come. First, there was a serpent to let finish coiling, and a cousin to let reach for the throne, and a trap that needed, before it could be sprung, to be baited with the appearance of a wounded and distracted king. So Sandro Moretti smiled at a woman with his beloved's face, and let his enemies believe they were winning, and waited, and bled quietly where no one could see, and counted the weeks until the burning. The seasons turned at the lonely shore. Isabella grew. She was a serious baby, watchful, given to long, solemn stares that unnerved strangers and delighted her mother. She had her father's eyes. Grace saw it more clearly every month, and it was both a wound and a comfort to look into her daughter's face and find, looking back at her, the ghost of the man she had left. Some nights she held the sleeping child and traced the dark brows, the set of the small jaw, and whispered things she would never have dared say to Sandro himself. "Your father was the most frightening man in New York, and the gentlest when no one was looking. He never told me he loved me. I think he did. I'll never know." She built a life. It surprised her how completely a life could be built out of small things. The garden, which had gone from a few stubborn tomatoes to a rioting profusion of vegetables and herbs and flowers that spilled over the fences and drew the neighbours to lean on the gate and admire. The diner, where she took a few shifts once Isabella was old enough for Rosa to mind, not because she needed the money, she was still careful with what she'd brought, but because she needed the company, the ordinary human noise of a place where people came to be fed. The church potlucks she was slowly, shyly drawn into. The friendships, real ones, the first she'd had in years that didn't require her to perform or protect herself. She realized one morning, standing in her garden with the sea wind in her hair and her daughter babbling in a basket at her feet. She was almost happy. Not the desperate happiness of the tower, always shadowed by the fear of losing it. A quieter thing, a happiness with its feet on the ground. She had made it herself, out of nothing, in a town at the end of the world, and it was hers. And yet, there were things she could not explain if she had let herself dwell on them. The strange good luck that seemed to follow her, the car trouble that resolved itself before she'd finished worrying, a mechanic who happened by, who wouldn't hear of taking payment. The time a man had followed her from the market, too close, too interested, and had then simply stopped, turned, walked away, and she'd never seen him again. And told herself she'd imagined the whole thing. The way the town's rougher elements, for even a small town has them, seemed to give her a wide and careful berth, as though some word had gone round that the widow at the end of the lane was not to be troubled. She noticed these things the way one notices a pattern in wallpaper. dimly, at the edge of attention, and then not at all, because to look directly at them was to invite questions she did not want to ask. She was safe. She had told herself she was safe. And the world kept agreeing with her, and she did not examine why. Once, though, she came close. It was a winter evening, Isabella nearly a year old, and Grace had gone out to the porch to bring in the washing before the rain. There was a car parked up the coast road, in the pull-off that overlooked the water, a nondescript sedan, its windows fogged, a shape inside. She had seen it before. She had seen it, she realized, standing there with the cold washing in her arms, many times. Different cars, but always a car, always in that pull-off, always with a shape inside that never seemed to be doing anything but watching the sea. Or watching the house. A chill went through her that had nothing to do with the wind. She stood very still, and the shape in the car went very still too, and for a long moment, across the gathering dark, they regarded each other, the woman on the porch and the watcher in the car. Then the car's engine started, and it pulled out, unhurried, and drove away up the coast road, and did not come back that night. Grace went inside and locked the door, and stood with her back against it, her heart pounding, and told herself a story. Tourists, a birdwatcher, a fisherman waiting on the tide, she told herself the story until she believed it. Because the alternative, that someone had been watching her, watching Isabella for a year, perhaps longer, was a door she could not open. Because if someone was watching, someone knew where she was, and if someone knew, then he might know. And if he knew, and had not come, she stopped the thought. She would not follow it to its end. It was too cruel, either way it turned. If he did not know, she was alone. If he knew and had not come, she was worse than alone. So she chose not to know, the way she had chosen not to know so many things in the tower, and she checked the locks twice, and she lay awake beside her sleeping daughter until the grey dawn. The next day there was a pie on her porch from Rosa, and a note from Mrs. Delgado about the church rummage sale, and the ordinary warmth of the town closed over the strangeness like water over a dropped stone. And Grace let it. She let it because she had to, because a woman raising a child alone at the edge of the world cannot afford to look too hard at the shadows, or she will never sleep again. She did not know that the watcher had reported the encounter. She did not know that in a study in New York, Sandro Moretti had read the report. Subject observed surveillance, appeared frightened, no further action, and had, for the first time, ordered his men to pull back, to watch from farther, to be less careful, in a sense, so that she would feel less watched. "She's afraid," he'd said to Renzo, and there had been something raw under the flatness of it. "I'm frightening her. Give her room. Just keep her safe, but give her room to breathe." It was again love expressed as absence. It was the only dialect he knew. And so the watchers pulled back to the horizon, and Grace's fear faded, and she went on building her small, good life at the lonely shore, tending her garden and raising her daughter, and never quite letting herself wonder why the world was so gentle with her, while 2,000 miles away a man moved the last pieces into place for a war she did not know was being fought, in part, for her. The flowers bloomed that spring in a profusion the neighbours called miraculous. Grace, on her knees in the good dark earth, with Isabella toddling in the rows, thought it was only the sea air and the care she'd put in. She did not know that a great deal more than sea air was keeping her garden safe. She only knew that things grew here at the lonely shore that she had thought would never grow again, including, slowly, painfully, the parts of her heart she had left in the rain in New York. In New York, the trap was nearly full. Vivian had been thorough. Over the months, she had funneled to Marco a fortune in stolen intelligence, account structures, the names of the family's silent partners in 3 cities, shipping routes, the private schedules of Sandro's movements. Marco had taken it all and built his strike around it, gathering his faction, arming them, choosing his moment. He was patient, but not infinitely so. The intelligence had a shelf life, and Vivian had begun to press for the reward she'd been promised, and both of these things pushed him, at last, toward action. What neither of them understood was that every piece of it had been chosen for them. The account structures were real, but they led to accounts Sandro had already emptied and left as bait. The silent partners were real, but 2 of the 3 had been quietly turned months ago and were feeding Marco false confidence. The shipping routes were real, but the shipment Marco planned to seize as his opening blow, the theft that would announce his strength and shame his cousin, was a shipment Sandro had personally arranged to be exactly where Marco expected it, guarded exactly as lightly as Marco believed, in a warehouse that was, in truth, a killing box. The only genuinely dangerous thing Vivian had stolen was something she didn't know the value of. In her rummaging through Sandro's private study, she'd grown bold over the months, believing herself trusted. She had found the drawer. And in the drawer, the photograph. Grace on the hospital steps, in the July sun, with a bundle in her arms. Vivian stood in the study with the photograph in her hand and understood all at once 3 things. The girl had not simply fled. She had fled pregnant. Sandro knew where she was. The photograph was surveillance, taken from a distance, dated. And Sandro had a child. Vivian's mind, which was quick and cold and entirely without mercy, ran the calculation in seconds. A child changed everything. A child was leverage of a kind that even Marco had not imagined. If Sandro loved the girl enough to watch over her in secret for a year, and the drawer held a year of reports she saw now, a thick file of them, then the girl and the child together were the softest, deepest, most vital thing in the whole hard empire. Marco was planning to strike at the family's money and territory, but this was a strike at the family's heart. She photographed the file, every page, and she went to Marco with it, expecting to be praised. Marco was not praised into gentleness. He was, if anything, made more dangerous. He sat in the safe house in Queens, where he did his real thinking, and looked at the photographs Vivian had brought him. The mother, the child, the little white house, the town, the coast road. And something moved behind his handsome face that even Vivian, who thought she knew him, found she did not like. "A daughter," Marco said softly. "He has a daughter." "It changes our position," Vivian said, eager. "We don't need to beat him in the streets. We take the girl, the child. He'll give us anything." "He'll give us nothing." Marco's voice cut across hers. "You still don't understand him after all these years. If we touch that child, he doesn't negotiate. He burns the world down and salts the ground, and he doesn't stop until every last one of us is in it. Touching the child isn't leverage, it's suicide." He set down the photographs. "No, we don't touch her. We use her." He tapped the image of the little white house. This is his weakness. Not something to seize, something to watch. When we make our move on the shipment, when he's occupied, when his eyes are on the war, that's when we make sure he knows we know. A message. A photograph on his desk. We can reach the shore whenever we like. We don't harm her. We just show him we could. And a man who's terrified for his child is a man who makes mistakes. It was, in its way, a smart plan. It was also the mistake that ended Marco Moretti, because it required one thing he did not have and could not get: time. For Vivian, in bringing Marco the photograph of the child, had made a fatal error of her own. She had been careless. She had accessed the drawer, photographed the file, and left. And she had believed herself unobserved, because she had grown to believe she was clever. But Sandro Moretti did not leave a drawer unwatched in a house he knew to be full of serpents. There was a camera. There was always a camera. And on the night Vivian photographed the file on his daughter, Sandro sat in a room 3 floors down and watched, in real time, on a screen, as a woman with his beloved's face photographed the images of his child and slipped them into her bag. He did not move. He did not make a sound. Renzo, beside him, watched his master's face and saw nothing change, and was more frightened by that stillness than he had ever been by any rage. "Boss," Renzo said quietly, "she's got the girl. She's got the baby. If she takes that to Marco, she's already taken it to Marco." Sandro's voice was very soft. "Or she will, within the hour. It's the only reason to steal it." "Then they know. They know where." "They've known where for a year, Renzo. My men in that town aren't invisible. I always assumed Marco would find her eventually. That's why I've spent a year making sure the whole town is mine. Every road, every dock, every man who could be bought. If Marco sends someone to that shore, I'll know before they cross the county line." He stood. "No, this doesn't frighten me." He turned, and now at last something moved in his face. Not fear, the opposite of fear. A terrible, cold arrival. The look of a man who has been waiting a very long time and has just been given the reason to stop waiting. This is what I needed. She's reached for the child. Marco will use the child, and the moment either of them so much as looks toward that shore, his voice dropped. I have every justification I will ever need. No one in this family, no one, will question what I do to a man who threatens a child. Not even Marco's own faction. He's just handed me their loyalty. He walked to the window and looked out at the burning city. Move the timeline up, he said. The shipment, Marco's move. I want it to happen this week. Feed him whatever he needs to feel ready. And Renzo, he did not turn. Triple the men at the shore, quietly. If anyone Marco sends gets within a mile of that house, I don't want them stopped. I want them gone. And I want to know the second it happens. Yes, boss. And Renzo, now he did turn, and his eyes were very dark. After this week, after it's done, I won't be here. You understand? Whatever's left, you hold it for me. Because the day this ends, I'm getting on a plane, and I'm going to the sea, and I am not coming back until I've brought them home. For 4 years he had waited. The waiting was over. The serpent had reached at last for the one thing that turned the patient man into a wolf, and in reaching had finally, fatally, overreached. Marco moved on a Friday. He had planned it for months and executed it in hours. The shipment, a truck carrying what he believed to be 3 million in laundered cash, and the ledgers that mapped the family's silent partnerships, was to be intercepted at a warehouse in Red Hook, taken clean, and the taking announced to the family's captains as proof that Sandro had grown weak, that the Eastern operation was porous, that a new hand was needed. He had a dozen men on it, his best, the core of his faction. He had Vivian's intelligence, which had never once failed him. He had, he believed, the element of surprise. He had walked into a room built to hold him. The warehouse in Red Hook was Sandro's. The truck was Sandro's, its cargo a careful fiction. The guards Marco's men expected to find, light, sleepy, easily overcome, were not guards at all. And the men who were actually in the warehouse, in the dark, in the rafters and the shipping containers and the office above, were the most loyal and most lethal soldiers the Moretti family possessed. And they had been waiting since before dawn. Marco's men came in at 11 that night. It was over by 11:20. Sandro was not there. A don does not stand in a killing box. That is what soldiers are for. He was in the study of the tower, on the phone, receiving the news in fragments as it came in. Contained. 6 down, 6 taken alive as instructed. Marco not present. He sent his men, stayed clear. Sandro had expected that. Marco was clever, and clever men send others to die. It did not matter. The 6 taken alive would talk, and the 6 who fell had already told him everything by falling. And Marco's faction, its core broken in a single night, its intelligence revealed as a trap, its confidence shattered, was already, though it did not yet know it, finished. But the warehouse was only the first move of the night, because Sandro had not built 4 years of patience to settle for breaking a faction. He wanted the roots. And the roots meant Marco himself, and the men around Marco who had not been in Red Hook, and the whole quiet architecture of the betrayal, pulled out of the ground in a single night so that nothing could ever grow back. He had called a dinner. It was an old tradition in the family, the Don's table, a gathering of the captains and the cousins and the men who mattered, called on short notice, attendance not optional. Sandro had called it for that same Friday night at the mansion in Westchester, and every man of consequence in the Moretti family had come, because when the Don calls the table, you come. Marco came. Of course Marco came. To stay away would have been to announce his guilt, and Marco did not yet know that Red Hook had failed. He came smiling, expecting to spend the evening performing loyalty, planning to slip away when word arrived of his triumph. Word arrived, all right, but not the word he expected. They were at the table. 30 men, the long room gold with candlelight, the wine poured, the first course served, when Renzo entered and bent to Sandro's ear and murmured something, and Sandro nodded and rose. The room fell silent. When the Don stands, everyone attends. "Thank you all for coming," Sandro said. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. It's been a long time since we sat together like this. Too long. So much has happened. So much has been rebuilt. He lifted his glass, and 30 men lifted theirs. To the family. To the family, they echoed. He drank. He set down the glass. And then, into the warm silence, in the same mild and patient voice, he said, 4 years ago, when we were bleeding, when the Castellanos had us by the throat, some of us held, and some of us made other arrangements. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. I've always believed, Sandro went on, moving now, walking slowly along the length of the table, that a man should be given room to reveal himself, that patience is not weakness, that if you wait long enough and watch closely enough, every serpent eventually shows you its whole length. He paused behind Marco's chair, rested one hand lightly on his cousin's shoulder. Marco had gone very still. Tonight, in Red Hook, some of our brothers tried to take something that belonged to this family. They believed they were striking a blow for new leadership. His hand tightened just slightly on Marco's shoulder. They're dead now. Or they're in a room downstairs telling us everything, every name, every arrangement, every conversation. He leaned down, close to Marco's ear, and said, in a voice pitched for the whole table to hear, every conversation, cousin, going back 4 years, going back to a woman in Geneva. Marco moved, a hand darting toward his jacket, but Marco had been a fool to come armed to the Don's table, and a greater fool to think he'd be allowed to draw, and Renzo's hand closed over his wrist like a vice before the gun cleared the cloth, and 2 more men were behind him, and it was done. It was over, the whole thing collapsing in an instant, the way a structure collapses when the one supporting beam is pulled. Sandro, Marco's voice cracked. The charm was gone. Underneath it was something small and frightened and cornered. Cousin, whatever they told you, they're lying to save themselves. You know how... I have the photographs, Marco. Sandro straightened. He looked, in the candlelight, like something carved. Of my daughter. That you took from Vivian, who took them from my desk. So please, don't insult me with lies. Not at my own table. Not tonight. A ripple went through the room. The captains, the neutral men, the ones who had not chosen a side. A daughter. He threatened the Don's child. Sandro watched it move through them and knew he had won them completely in that instant, because there is a line even hard men do not cross, and Marco, in reaching for the child, had crossed it, and every man at that table knew it. Take him downstairs, Sandro said quietly, and bring me the woman. They took Marco out. He did not go quietly at the end. The mask fell entirely, and what came out from under it was ugly, curses and threats, and a high, thin note of terror. But he went, and the door closed behind him, and the long gold room was silent. The rest of you, Sandro said, turning to the table, will stay. We have a great deal to discuss about how this happened, and who knew, and who looked away. Some of you have nothing to fear. His eyes moved down the table, and men who met them felt them like a blade. Some of you do. By morning, I'll know which is which. Sit, eat. No one leaves this house tonight. No one moved to leave. No one would have dared. And upstairs, in a locked room, a woman with Grace's face was waiting to learn that the game she thought she had won had, in fact, been over from the very first day, and that the man she had betrayed twice had known, all along, exactly what she was. They brought her to him in the study near midnight. Vivian Lombardi came through the door with her chin up, because she had spent her whole life learning to walk into rooms as though she owned them. And even now, even with the two silent men behind her, and the locked door, and the terrible quiet of the great house, she made herself believe she could talk her way out. She had always been able to talk her way out. Sandro was at the window, his back to her, exactly as he had been the day Grace first saw him. He did not turn. "Sit," he said. She sat. She arranged herself in the chair, crossed her legs, and looked at the back of the man she had betrayed, and she began, because attack had always been her best defence, with wounded innocence. "Whatever Marco's told you," she said, "he's lying to save himself. You know what he is. He's used me, Sandro, the same as he tried to use you. I came back for you. I've only ever—" "Stop." He said it without heat, and she stopped, because there was something in the single syllable that closed her throat. "I want you to listen to me very carefully, Vivian, because I'm only going to explain this once, and then you're going to understand exactly how completely you lost, and then we're going to discuss what happens to you." He turned. She had known him for years. She had shared his bed, his life, the whole of his rise, and the beginning of his fall. And she realized, looking at his face in the lamplight, that she had never once seen the man who was looking at her now. The Sandro she'd known had been young and hungry and reachable. This man was none of those things. This man was granite with eyes. "I knew you were coming before your plane landed," Sandro said. "I knew Marco sent you. I knew what you were sent to do, to seduce, to spy, to steal, to break the girl. I knew from the first day, Vivian. Every document you copied, I left for you to find. Every secret you stole, I chose. Every route you gave Marco led exactly where I wanted his men to go, which, tonight, was into a warehouse in Red Hook, where most of them died, and the rest are downstairs telling me the rest of what I already know." He watched the colour drain from her face. "You never deceived me for a single hour. You've spent months being a courier for a message I wrote myself." "No," she whispered. "The one thing," Sandro went on, relentless now, "the one thing you found that I hadn't planned for. The photographs of my daughter. Even that you handed straight into my trap. Because the moment you took those to Marco and he decided to use my child against me, you gave every neutral captain in this family a reason to want him dead. And you gave me the one justification I never even had to manufacture. You didn't just fail, Vivian. You built my victory for me, brick by brick, and thanked me for the chance to do it." Vivian sat very still. And then, because she was cruel, and because cruelty was the last card she had, she found the wound and pressed it. But she left you. A thin, vicious smile. The girl. Whatever your grand plan was, she still left. She still ran into the rain carrying your child, believing you'd never loved her, believing she was just my shadow. That was me, Sandro. Whatever you knew, whatever you planned, I broke her. I sent her running, and you, the smile widened, you let her go. A whole year. You knew where she was, and you never came, so don't sit there and tell me you won. You may have Marco, but you lost her too, and you lost her all by yourself. The room went very quiet, and for one moment, one single moment, Vivian saw that she had struck home. She saw it move across his face, the one thing she'd said that was true, the one wound that all his patience and all his planning could not armour. He had won everything, and in the winning he had lost a year with the woman he loved and the daughter he'd never held, and no victory in that gold house could give it back. But the moment passed, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady, and what he said took the last of the ground out from under her. "You're right," he said quietly. "That's the one thing I got wrong. I protected her by staying away, and staying away hurt her almost as much as anything you did. I'll carry that. I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." He looked at her. "But understand what you've just told me, Vivian. You've told me that hurting her is the thing you're proudest of, that breaking a frightened girl who never did you any harm is the great achievement of your life." He shook his head slowly. "I was going to let you leave, alive, penniless, exiled, but alive, because I don't kill women, and because you were, once, someone I cared for. But you've just shown me exactly what you are, and I find I no longer feel generous." Fear, at last, real fear, flooded her face. "Sandro, you'll live." He turned back to the window, done with her. But not here, not in this country, not with a single dollar of Marco's money, or a single friend who'll take your call. Everything you have, you got through this family, and this family is taking it back. Tonight, you leave with what you're wearing. There's a car. It'll take you to a plane. The plane goes to a place where no one knows your name, and no one owes you anything. If you ever come back, if you ever go near her or the child, or say either of their names aloud, the mercy I'm showing you tonight expires." He paused. "Do you understand?" She understood. She had wagered her whole life on two bets, Marco's rise and her own cleverness, and both had failed on the same night, and she had nothing left, not even the small satisfaction of having hurt him, because he had taken even that and turned it into a vow to do better. "Get her out of my sight," Sandro said. They took her out. She did not go with her chin up. She went the way the truly defeated go, small and grey and silent, out of the golden house and into a plain car and out of the story entirely, into an exile from which she would never return, having played for everything and lost everything, including the one thing she'd never valued and never understood, the difference between the woman she was and the woman she'd tried to replace. When the door had closed and the house was quiet, Sandro stood at the window a long time, alone. Below him the city burned, gold and endless, the empire he had bled 4 years to save. He had it all now. Marco was finished. Vivian was gone. The family was his, more completely than it had ever been. And it meant nothing. It had always meant nothing, next to a little white house at the edge of a distant sea. He took the photograph from the drawer. Grace on the hospital steps, the July sun, the child in her arms. And he looked at it, and then he picked up the phone. "Renzo," he said, Ready the plane. We fly west at dawn. The plane went up into the dark before the sun, and Sandro Moretti sat alone in the cabin and watched the lights of New York fall away beneath him for the first time in 4 years, and tried to find the words. He had faced armed men without his pulse changing. He had sat across a table from cousins who wanted him dead and never blinked. He had, the night before, dismantled an entire conspiracy over dinner with the calm of a man carving a roast. And now, 30,000 feet over a dark country, flying toward a woman and a child in a little white house, Alessandro Moretti was afraid. Because there was no plan for this. There was no leverage, no patience, no long game. There was only the truth, which he had never once in his life said aloud, and a woman who had every reason to shut the door in his face. He tried to imagine it. The door of the little white house opening, her face, what would be in it? Anger, certainly. She had left believing he'd never loved her, believing she was a shadow. And then he had let her go. A year, 2 years now, knowing where she was and never coming. How did you explain that? I stayed away to keep you safe. It was true. It was the truest thing he had ever done, and he knew with a clarity that frightened him that it would not be enough. That I stayed away because I loved you was, to the person left standing alone in the rain, almost indistinguishable from, I did not come because I did not care. He had chosen the language of love she could not read, and now he had to translate 4 years of it into words she could. Renzo came back to the cabin near dawn, when the sky ahead had begun to grey. Boss. He sat uninvited, which he had earned the right to do decades ago. Can I say something? When have you ever needed permission? She's going to be angry. I know. No, Renzo leaned forward. I mean it. You need to hear it before you get there, because you don't think like she thinks. You're going in there like it's a negotiation, like if you present the facts clearly enough, she'll see you were right. He shook his head. She's not going to care that you were right. She's going to care that she was alone, that she had the baby alone. First fever alone, first steps, first word, first everything alone, thinking the man she loved didn't want her. All the while you were watching from a car up the road. His voice was gentle, but it did not spare. You saved her, boss. You saved her and the kid 100 times over, and she'll never even know most of it. But from where she stood, you abandoned her. And both of those are true at the same time. You have to walk in there holding both. If you only bring the part where you were right, you'll lose her for good. Sandro was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the first red line of the sun came up over the curve of the earth. When did you become wise about women? He said finally. I was married 30 years, boss. Wisest thing I ever learned. Being right is the least important part of being sorry. Renzo sat back. Lead with the sorry. Lead with I hurt you. The reasons come after, if she wants them, not before. Sandro looked at his oldest friend, and something in his hard face eased, just slightly. Thank you, Renzo. Don't thank me. Just don't ruin it. I've flown across the country. I'd like it to be worth the trip. He stood, hesitated. One more thing. The girl, Isabella. A pause. You've never seen her, not really, just pictures. He looked at his Don with something almost like tenderness. Whatever happens with the mother, take a minute when you get there and just look at your kid. You've earned that much. 4 years you protected a child you never met. Look at her before you say anything to anyone. It'll steady you. He went back up to the front and left Sandro alone with the sunrise and the enormity of what he was flying toward. He took out the photographs, all of them now, the whole file, 4 years of a life watched from a distance. Grace in the garden, Grace at the diner, laughing at something outside the frame, and the sight of that laugh, that ease, that happiness she'd built without him, undid him more than any of it, because it meant she had healed, she had made a life, and he was about to walk into it uninvited and ask her to risk it all over again on him. Isabella as a newborn, as a fat, serious baby, as a toddler in the garden rose, dark-eyed, watchful, his. He looked at his daughter's face and felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed since he was a boy, and he understood that Renzo was right, that whatever happened with Grace, he had to see this child, had to hold her once, had to have that, even if he had nothing else. The plane came down in the late morning at a small airfield inland, and there were cars waiting. His men, the ones who had watched the shore for 2 years, hard, quiet men, who looked at their Don with a new wariness now that he was here in the flesh among them. He got in the car. The drive to the coast took an hour, up through the hills and down again to where the land broke apart into headlands and coves, and the great grey plain of the Pacific opened out beneath a sky washed clean by wind. And then they came over the last rise, and there it was, the little white house at the end of the lane, weathered, salt-stung, its garden a riot of colour spilling over the fences. He could see it even from here, the flowers, the impossible profusion of them, the life she had coaxed out of the poor, salt soil. Smoke from the chimney, washing on a line, moving in the wind. A child's small, bright shape in the garden, and a woman kneeling in the rows beside her. "Stop here," Sandro said. The car stopped at the top of the lane. He got out. He told the men to stay, and then Alessandro Moretti, Don of the Moretti family, who had crossed a country and burned an empire's worth of enemies to reach this exact patch of ground, stood at the top of the lane in the sea wind, and could not, for a long moment, make his feet move. Down in the garden the woman rose. She had felt it, the way you feel eyes, the way she had felt the watcher in the car all those months ago. She straightened and shaded her eyes and looked up the lane at the man standing there. And even from that distance, even after 2 years, even against the sun, she knew him. Of course she knew him. She would have known that stillness anywhere. Grace Sullivan went very still in her garden, one hand at her brow, the other reaching down, without looking, to draw her daughter against her legs. And at the top of the lane, Sandro Moretti finally made his feet move, and began, slowly, to walk down toward the sea, and the house, and everything he had ever wanted, and the reckoning he had flown across a country to face. He stopped at the garden gate. Up close she was more beautiful and more real than any photograph, browned by 2 years of sun and wind, stronger, older around the eyes, and looking at him with an expression he could not read, which frightened him, because he had always been able to read her. That was the first thing he understood, that the 2 years had made her into someone he would have to learn all over again. The child pressed against her legs and stared up at him with his own dark eyes, unafraid, only curious. And Sandro looked down at his daughter for the first time in his life across a garden gate, and forgot, entirely, every word he had prepared on the plane. "Grace," he said. It came out rough. "How long?" she said. He didn't understand. How long have you known where I was?" Her voice was steady, terribly steady, the steadiness of someone holding something very heavy, very carefully. "The car up the coast, the one that was always there. That was yours, wasn't it? Don't lie to me, Sandro. Whatever else, don't lie to me now." He could have softened it. He didn't. Renzo's voice was in his head. Lead with the truth. Lead with, "I hurt you." And so he gave her the whole terrible weight of it, standing at her gate with the sea wind pulling at them both. "From the night you left," he said, "I found you within a week. I've had men watching you the entire time. 2 years. He made himself hold her eyes. "The car you saw was mine. The doctor who moved to town was mine. The car trouble that fixed itself, the man who followed you from the market and then didn't, mine. All of it. I've known where you were, and how you were, and—" his voice caught. "And I've known about her, since the day she was born. I have a photograph of you carrying her down the hospital steps. I've watched her grow up in reports filed from a car up the road." He stopped. "I have never lied to you, Grace. I'm not going to start now, even though the truth makes me a monster. I knew. I always knew. And I didn't come." He watched it land. He watched 2 years of a story she'd told herself. "He doesn't know. I'm alone. No one is coming." Collapse and rearrange itself into something far worse. He knew and chose not to come. He watched her face go white, and then flush, and then white again, and he watched her arm tighten around the child, and he braced himself for the fury he deserved. But Grace didn't scream. She did something worse. Her eyes filled, and her voice dropped to almost nothing, and she said, "Why? Why would you do that? If you knew I was here, if you knew about her, why would you leave me alone? Do you have any idea?" Her voice broke, and she fought it back. "Do you have any idea what these 2 years have been?" A tear escaped, ran down her wind-browned cheek. "I had her alone, Sandro. Rosa held my hand because there was no one else. I sat up with her through a fever, thinking I might lose her, and I had no one. And you were watching, from a car. You watched me be that alone, and you stayed in the car." And there it was. Renzo had been right. This was the wound, and no explanation could reach it, because the explanation and the wound were the same thing. "I know," Sandro said. His own voice was not steady now. "I know. There's no version of what I did that isn't that. I stayed in the car. So tell me why." He set his hand on the gate, not opening it, just resting it there, as though he needed something to hold. And he told her. Because I was at war. He said it quietly. From the night you left, I was in a war for the family, and I didn't win it until 3 days ago. My cousin Marco spent 4 years trying to take everything I have. Vivian didn't come back on her own, Grace. He sent her. To spy, to steal, to break you. The whispers, the maids, all of it was her. All of it was aimed at driving you out, and it worked, and I let it work, because I was watching the bigger board, and I didn't see how fast they were breaking you until you were already gone. His hand tightened on the gate, and when you were gone, I had a choice. Bring you back into a house full of serpents, where every enemy I had would learn in a week that the coldest man in New York had one soft place, a woman and a child he'd die for. They would have used you. They would have hurt you to hurt me. They would have hurt her. His eyes went to the little girl and away. Or leave you here, believing yourself free, and put a wall of men around this shore so nothing could ever reach you, and finish the war, and burn it so completely to the ground that when I finally came, if I finally came, there would be nothing left in the world that could ever touch you again. He drew a breath. So that's why. Not because I didn't want you, because I wanted you too much, and I didn't know how to keep you except by staying away. It was the worst decision of my life, and I would understand if you never forgive it. But you asked for the truth, and the truth is, every day I didn't come, I was trying to build you a world where no one could make you cry again. He looked at her, and for the first time in the whole conversation, his composure cracked entirely, and what showed underneath was not the Don, was not the granite, was just a man. I did it so badly, Grace. I know that now. Renzo told me on the plane, you don't want to be protected by a man who isn't there. You wanted him to just come. And I didn't. I chose the wall over the door, and I'll be sorry for it for the rest of my life. Grace stood in her garden, with her daughter against her legs, and the tears running freely now, and the sea wind wrapping them all, and she did not speak for a long time. You said, her voice was almost gone, you said all of it was aimed at driving me out. The whispers, that she came back because he sent her, that she was a move in a game. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a rough, childlike gesture. But Sandro, even if all that's true, even if she was a lie and he was a snake and you knew it all along, there's one thing that was never a lie. She looked up at him. You never told me you loved me. Not once, in 4 years. I left because I thought I was her shadow. I left because every day I lived in that house, I lay next to a man who reached for me in the dark and never, ever said my name like it was the only one. Whatever war you were fighting, that part wasn't Marco. That part wasn't Vivian. That part was just you. So don't tell me they drove me out. You let me believe I was nothing to you for 4 years, and you never once corrected it. And that was the deeper wound. The one beneath the wound. The one that had nothing to do with the war at all. And Sandro, standing at the gate, understood that this was the real reckoning, the thing he had flown across a country to answer, and that everything depended on whether he could finally, at long last, in the space of the next few words, do the one thing he had never learned how to do. He opened the gate. He came into the garden slowly, and he did not touch her, and he went down, the dawn of the Moretti family in the salt and the good dark earth, went down on one knee among the flowers she had grown, not proposing, just bringing himself level with the truth, level with her, level with the child, watching him with his own dark eyes. And he said the thing he had never said. I loved you from the first tear. Grace made a small, broken sound. The first day, in the tower, when they brought you in and you begged me for your family and you were terrified and you fought me anyway. You wept and you defied me in the same breath, and I looked at you and I understood you were nothing like her, that you had her face and none of her poison, that you were the bravest thing I'd ever seen. His voice was thick. I built the contract because I didn't know how else to keep you. If I'd shown the world what you were to me, they'd have taken you. So I hid it. From them, from you, from myself some days. I told myself it was strategy. It was cowardice. I was afraid of how much He stopped, started again. I never said your name in the dark, because if I'd started saying it, I'd never have been able to stop, and then everyone would have seen, and I didn't know how to want something that much and still keep it safe. So I said nothing, and I let you believe you were a shadow, when the truth is, you were the only real thing I ever had. You were never anyone's shadow, Grace. You were the light I was hiding so no one could put it out. The wind moved through the garden. The child looked between them, solemn. I loved you from the first tear, Sandro said again, quietly, kneeling in her flowers. I've loved you every day of 4 years, including every day I stayed in the car. I know it's too late to say it well. I'm saying it anyway, because you should have heard it 1,000 times, and you heard it 0, and that's the thing I got most wrong of all. And Grace Sullivan, who had run into the rain to give another woman her place, who had built a life out of nothing at the lonely shore, who had told herself for 2 years that she was fine, that she was healed, that she had let him go, put her hand over her mouth and wept, and could not for a long moment say anything at all. For a long time neither of them spoke. The sea breathed against the rocks below. The child, sensing something too large for her to understand, reached up and patted her mother's leg, and Grace looked down at Isabella and drew a shaking breath and got herself back under control, because that was the discipline motherhood had taught her. You do not fall apart in front of the child, however much the falling apart is owed. Her name is Isabella, Grace said. Her voice was wrecked, but steady. Isabella Sullivan. Sandro looked at his daughter. He had seen her in 100 photographs. He was not prepared at all for the reality of her, the specific weight of her attention, the exact dark of eyes that were his own eyes looking back at him, the small, solemn dignity of her. He had prepared himself to plead his case to Grace. He had not prepared himself for this, and it took him apart more completely than anything Vivian or Marco had ever managed. Isabella, he said. He was still on one knee. He did not reach for her. He understood, dimly, that he had no right to reach for her, that he had forfeited that by staying in the car. Hello. Isabella regarded him. Then, with the terrible, unearned generosity of small children, she detached from her mother's leg, took 3 unsteady steps across the garden rows and held out to him a flower she had been clutching in one fist, a crushed and half-wilted marigold, orange as the coming dusk. "Flower," she announced. And Alessandro Moretti, who had watched men die without changing expression, who had dismantled a conspiracy over dinner and exiled a woman without raising his voice, took the crushed flower from his daughter's hand as though it were the most valuable thing in the world, and could not speak, and had to look down at the earth for a moment to master himself. "Thank you," he managed finally. "It's the best flower I've ever been given." Grace watched this, her daughter and the man she'd run from kneeling together in the flowers, and felt something she had spent 2 years holding shut come loose in her chest. She had built the wall too. She saw that now. He'd built his wall of men around the shore. She'd built hers of certainty around her heart. He never loved me. I was a shadow. I'm fine now. I let him go. And it had been just as false, just as much a way of surviving a thing too big to face. And it was crumbling now, the same way his had, brick by brick, in a garden by the sea. "You should get up," she said roughly. "You look ridiculous. Come inside. Not because I've forgiven you, because the neighbours are going to talk, and because your men are still standing at the top of the lane like a firing squad, and it's frightening Mrs. Delgado's cat." It was not forgiveness. But it was the door, opening an inch. And Sandro, who had learned patience the hard way, understood that an inch was more than he'd had any right to expect, and rose, and followed his daughter and the woman he loved into the little white house. Inside it was small and warm and entirely hers. He looked around at it the way a man looks at a country he's heard about all his life and never visited. The warm furniture, the child's drawings on the wall, the herbs drying by the window, the photographs. None of him, he noted, and understood the omission, and did not flinch from it. The whole snug, hand-built shape of a life she had made without him. It was the opposite of the tower in every way. It was the first home he had stood inside in 20 years that felt like a home. She made coffee because her hands needed something to do. She set Isabella up with blocks on the floor, and then she sat across the small kitchen table from the most dangerous man in New York and said, "Tell me what happened. All of it. Marco, Vivian, the war. You said you finished it 3 days ago. I want to know everything you kept from me. No more shadows. If we're going to—" She stopped, unwilling to finish the sentence, unsure herself where it led. "If you're going to sit at my table, I want the truth, the whole of it, starting from the day I signed that contract." So he told her. He told her all of it, in the low, steady voice she remembered, over the coffee going cold between them, while their daughter built and knocked down towers of blocks on the floor. He told her about the day she'd signed, and what he'd felt and hidden. He told her about the 4 years of secretly rebuilding her family, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, because she'd always half known and never let herself believe it. He told her about Marco, the whole long history of the grievance and the betrayal. He told her the truth about Vivian, that she'd never left with no choice, that she'd betrayed him for Marco 4 years ago and come back as Marco's blade, that the pitiable victim's story had been a weapon from the first word. He told her about the whispers, the maids, the orchestrated cruelty, and Grace closed her eyes and felt 2 years of self-blame. I was weak, I ran, I should have been stronger. dissolve into something cleaner and more furious. She hadn't been weak. She'd been hunted. And he told her about the night she left, the letter, the rain, Renzo asking, "Do we bring her back?" and his own terrible answer. "I've asked myself 1,000 times if I'd do it differently," he said. "And the honest answer is, I don't know. If I'd brought you back that night, into that house, with Marco's move still coming, I think you'd have been in the middle of a war, and I think they'd have hurt you, and I couldn't have lived with that. But I also let you have her alone. First fever, alone. Everything alone. And I can't live with that either." There was no right answer. There was only a choice between two things I couldn't live with. And I chose the one that kept you breathing, and it cost you everything else. He looked at her. "That's the truth. It's not a good truth. But you asked for all of it." Grace was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to go gold, the long, slow California dusk coming down over the water. "You could have called," she said at last. "In 2 years. One phone call. You didn't have to bring me back into the war to just tell me I wasn't alone. That you knew. That you—" her voice thickened. "That someone in the world knew where I was and cared whether I lived. I know. Why didn't you?" And Sandro Moretti, who had a reason for everything, who had planned 4 years down to the hour, looked at the woman across the table and gave her the only answer left, which was no answer at all. "Because I was a coward," he said. "About this one thing, the only thing. I could face anything except the sound of your voice telling me you'd stopped loving me. So I never called. Because as long as I never called, I could believe there was still a door somewhere at the end of it all that I could walk through. I was too afraid to find out if it was already closed." The gold light filled the little kitchen. Their daughter knocked down a tower of blocks and laughed. And Grace looked at him across the table, this cold and terrible and utterly undone man who had crossed a country to kneel in her flowers. And she found that the wall she'd built was almost entirely gone now, and that behind it was the same thing that had always been there, the thing she'd carried west in the rain and never once managed to leave behind. "It's not closed," she said quietly. "God help me, Sandro. I tried for 2 years. It never closed." They did not fall into each other's arms. It was not that kind of moment, and they were not, either of them, that kind of people anymore. Too much had happened, too much had been paid to make it simple. What happened instead was slower and truer and harder won. He stayed. Not in the house. He took a room at the town's one small inn, at her insistence, because she would not have him under her roof and Isabella's until she was sure, until the thing between them had been tested against daylight and ordinary hours, and the long, unglamorous work of trust rebuilt. And Sandro, who had never in his adult life been told no and obeyed it, and took the small room at the inn, and came each morning to the little white house, and courted, there was no other word for it, the woman he had already loved for 6 years, from the beginning, as though for the first time. It was strange, and it was healing, and it undid the town entirely. He was hopeless at it at first. He did not know how to be ordinary. He had spent 20 years learning to be feared and had no idea how to be simply present. He would arrive in the morning, not knowing what to do with his hands. He tried to buy things. He tried that first week to buy her a car, a better house, to pay off the inn and take the whole floor, to import a chef, and Grace put a stop to all of it with a flat look that would have made his captains flinch. "That's not how this works," she said. "You can't buy your way back in, Sandro. You bought your way in the first time, and look how that ended. If you want to be here, you're going to have to actually be here. Pull weeds, change diapers, learn how she likes her toast. Sit on the porch and watch the sea and say nothing and let it be enough. That's the price. It's the only price. And it's higher than anything you paid Marco or the Castellanos or anyone, because you can't do it with money or violence, and those are the only two things you know." He learned. He learned to pull weeds, badly at first, pulling up her seedlings along with the crabgrass, until she taught him the difference, kneeling beside him in the dark earth with her hands over his, and neither of them said anything about the way that was the first time they'd touched. He learned how Isabella liked her toast, cut in triangles, the crust off, butter to the very edges. He learned, to his own astonishment, to change a diaper, and the day he did it without help, Renzo, who had stayed on, who had watched all this unfold with a private and enormous satisfaction, had to leave the room to keep from laughing, and Sandro caught him at it, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, the Don laughed too. He sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the sea and learned to let it be enough. And Grace, watching him learn, watching the coldest man she'd ever known kneel in her garden and cut toast into triangles and hold their daughter with a careful, tentative wonder, felt the last of the ice go out of her heart, slowly, the way ice goes out of a river in spring, not all at once, but section by section, with cracks and groans and the sudden startling rush of water underneath. They talked. God, how they talked. All the talking they'd never done in 4 years in the tower, poured out now over coffee and over weeding and over the long gold evenings on the porch. She told him about the drive west, the 6 days, the crying on the shoulder of the turnpike. He flinched at that, and she made him hear all of it, because she needed him to know exactly what it had cost, and he needed to know, and taking it was part of the price. She told him about Isabella's birth, Rosa's hand in hers, and he wept, actually wept, silently, looking out at the sea, and she reached over, the first time she reached for him, and put her hand on his arm, and that was another wall gone. He told her things too, things she'd never known in 4 years, about Naples, about the boyhood scar, about the brother he'd lost before Marco's father, about the exact shape of the 4 years of war and what it had done to him, what he'd become to survive it. He was not a good man, they both knew it. He had done things she would never fully know and did not want to, and he did not pretend otherwise. And there was a night on the porch when he laid the worst of it out, as plainly as he could, because he would not build this new thing on the same hidden foundation as the old one. "You should know what I am," he said, "before you decide. I'm not going to become someone else. The empire is still there. I've handed the day-to-day to men I trust. I'm going to spend as much of my life here as you'll let me. But I am what I am, Grace. There's blood on all of it. On the money that rebuilt your father's company, on the men who kept you safe on this shore. If you take me, you take that. I won't lie to you about it ever again, but I won't pretend it's clean either." And Grace was quiet a long time, looking at the sea, and then she said, I've always known what you are. I knew the day I signed. I've never once been confused about it. She turned to him. What I was confused about was whether any of that darkness had a place in it for me. That's the only thing I ever needed to know. Everything else I made my peace with a long time ago. The rain came, one night in the third week, a proper storm, the kind that had followed her west, drumming on the roof of the little white house. Grace lay awake listening to it, as she always did, unable to sleep in the rain. And this time, for the first time in 2 years, she was not alone with it, because he was there, having finally, that evening, been allowed past the door of the inn, and past the door of the house, and past the last of the walls, and he woke without a sound the way he always had, and felt her lying awake beside him. "The rain," he said quietly. "I still can't sleep in it." He drew her in against him, and she let herself be drawn, and he held her while the storm broke over the little house at the lonely shore. And after a while, because he had learned, finally, at terrible cost, the one thing he'd never known how to do, he said her name into the dark. Just her name. Grace. The way she'd waited 4 years and 2 more to hear it, as though it were the only name in the world, and she slept, at last, through the rain. They did not marry right away. There was too much still to untangle. A life on 2 coasts, an empire that could not simply be abandoned, a child who came first before anything, and 2 people learning, at their own careful pace, to trust the ground beneath a thing that had cost them both so much. But the shape of the future settled, over that autumn, into something that surprised everyone, including themselves. Sandro did not bring them to New York. That was the first and clearest thing, and it was his idea before it was hers. "Lad House tried to eat you once," he said. "I'm not putting you back in it." He kept the tower, kept the empire, kept the cold machinery of the family running under trusted hands, Renzo chief among them, elevated now to a position that would have astonished the old Don who'd once merely driven the car. But Sandro himself moved his centre of gravity west, to the coast, to the little town at the lonely shore, running what needed running by phone and by encrypted line, and by the occasional necessary flight east, and spending the rest of his days doing the only work he had come to consider real, pulling weeds, cutting toast, learning his daughter, courting his daughter's mother. The men who had watched the shore for 2 years stayed on, but differently now, no longer a wall she didn't know about, but a quiet, acknowledged presence, part of the strange fabric of their lives. The town absorbed it all with the pragmatic discretion of small towns everywhere. If people wondered about the widow at the end of the lane, whose dead husband had turned out to be alive and rich and surrounded by watchful men, they kept their wondering to themselves, and were rewarded with a new clinic the town had needed for a decade, a repaired harbour, a scholarship fund that appeared from nowhere, and the general sense that, whatever the man at the little white house was, he was theirs now, and looked after his own. There were reckonings still to come, and they came. Her father. That was the hardest. Thomas Sullivan flew out when he learned that his daughter was alive and well and had a child, learned who the child's father was, learned the whole tangled truth of the contract he'd blamed himself for since the night his daughter signed it. He came ready to hate the man who'd bought his daughter, and he found instead a quieter and more complicated thing. The knowledge that the same man had, in secret, spent 4 years rebuilding everything Thomas had lost, asking nothing, taking no credit, doing it, as he told Grace once and Grace told her father, because it mattered to you. The two men walked on the beach, the old broken developer and the cold young Dom, and no one knew what was said. But Thomas Sullivan came back from that walk with the look of a man who had set down something he'd been carrying for years. "He's not what I thought," was all he'd say afterward. "I don't understand him. I don't think I'm supposed to. But he'd walk into fire for you and the baby, Gracie. I've met a lot of men who said they would. He's the first one I believed." And Isabella, who had handed a crushed marigold to a stranger at the garden gate, took to her father with the whole, open, unguarded generosity of a child who had never learned to be afraid. She did not know what he was. She would learn, some day, some careful, edited portion of it. That was a conversation for years hence, and it kept Grace awake some nights, the question of what and how and when to tell her. But for now Isabella knew only that a man had come to live near the sea who cut her toast right and let her ride on his shoulders and taught her with infinite patience the names of the flowers in the garden, and who looked at her. She was too young to have words for it, but she felt it, as though she were the single most important thing that had ever existed. Which to Alessandro Moretti she was, she and her mother. The two soft things at the centre of a hard man's hard world, the home at the heart of the empire, the reason for all of it. There was one more storm, of a different kind, near the end of that first autumn. Word came from the east. A remnant of Marco's faction, a man who had escaped the net, made a clumsy attempt to profit from what he knew, to sell the location of the Don's secret family to the family's enemies. It came to nothing. It came to nothing so quickly and so completely that Grace barely learned of it. A tension in Sandro for 2 days, a flurry of calls, Renzo grim-faced, and then it was simply over. The man gone, the threat erased, the shore quiet again. But it was a reminder, and they both took it as one, that the darkness was real, that it would always be there at the edges, that the price of the life they were building was eternal vigilance, and the certain knowledge that some part of the world would always want to take it from them. "Does it ever end?" Grace asked him that night on the porch after the thing had been dealt with. "The looking over your shoulder, the men in the cars. Does it ever just end?" "No," Sandro said. He never lied to her now. Not entirely. Not for someone in my position. There will always be someone. That's the truth of it, and you should have it plain. He was quiet a moment, looking out at the dark water. But it can be held. Kept out there, on the horizon, where it stays. That's the most I can promise you. Not a world without danger. A wall between the danger and this porch that I will spend the rest of my life keeping strong. He turned to her. "I built that wall wrong the first time. I built it between you and me. I understand now it goes on the outside. You and Isabella on the inside, with me, and everything else out there beyond it. That's the only way I know how to love you, from the inside of the wall, not across it." Grace reached over and took his hand, the hand that had done things she would never know, the hand that cut toast into triangles and pulled weeds and held their daughter. And she laced her fingers through his, and they sat on the porch of the little white house and watched the last light go out of the western sky. And neither of them said anything else, because for once, nothing else needed saying. The empire stood, far away, gold and dangerous and endless. And here, at the lonely shore, a smaller and infinitely more valuable thing stood too, and would go on standing, held safe now, behind a wall built at last in the right place. They married in the spring, in the garden, when the flowers were at their most riotous. It was nothing like the wedding a man of Sandro's position would have been expected to have. No cathedral, no 500 guests, no photographs in the society pages. It was Rosa and Mrs. Delgado and the doctor and a handful of townsfolk, and Grace's father giving her away with tears streaming down his face, and Renzo standing up for the groom in a suit that cost more than the church, weeping openly and not caring who saw. It was Isabella, nearly 3 now, marching down the garden path in a white dress, scattering flower petals with tremendous seriousness, dropping them one at a time and pausing to inspect each placement. It was the sea, always the sea, breathing against the rocks below, and the gold light of a California evening, and a woman in a simple dress with flowers in her dark hair, walking toward a man who had crossed a country and burned an empire's worth of enemies, and learned, at last, to cut toast into triangles, to reach the place he'd been walking toward his whole life. They wrote their own vows, because the standard ones did not fit 2 people who had come to each other by such a strange and broken road. Grace went first. Her voice shook, but she got through it. "I loved you," she said, "from the moment I understood you were quietly saving my family and would never take credit for it. I loved you when I thought I was a shadow. I loved you the whole time I was running away from you, and every day at this shore. And I told myself I'd stopped, and I never had, not for one single day. I ran, because I wasn't brave enough to watch you choose someone else. And it turned out you'd chosen me all along, from the first tear, and were just too afraid to say it. Which means we spent 6 years, both of us, loving each other in silence, out of fear." She smiled through her tears. "So here's the vow. No more silence. Whatever else this life is, dangerous, complicated, full of things I'll never fully understand, it will never again be silent about this one thing. I love you, Sandro. I'm going to say it out loud every day for the rest of my life, until you're so tired of hearing it you beg me to stop, and then I'm going to say it again." And Sandro, who had rehearsed nothing because he had finally learned that the truth needed no rehearsal, took her hands and said, "You were never anyone's shadow." His voice was low and rough and entirely steady. "You were the light I hid so no one could put it out. I loved you from the very first tear, when you wept and fought me in the same breath, and I understood I'd found something I would burn the whole world down to keep. I hid it behind a contract. I hid it behind a war. I hid it behind 2,000 miles and 2 years of silence, and I told myself every hidden day that I was protecting you. And I was. And it was still the greatest mistake of my life, because the one thing you needed that I never gave you was the simplest thing of all. So I'm giving it to you now, in front of everyone. In the garden you grew out of nothing at the edge of the world." He drew a breath. "I love you. I have loved you longer than you know and worse than you deserved, and I will love you better now, out loud, for the rest of my life. You and Isabella are the only things I've ever owned that were worth having. Everything else is just the wall I keep around you." They were married as the sun went down. Isabella, having finished with the petals, wandered up and inserted herself between their legs at the crucial moment. And so the kiss that sealed it happened with a small, dark-eyed girl wedged between them, laughing. And no one had ever seen the cold Don of the Moretti family look the way he looked in that moment. And Renzo, telling the story for years afterward, always had to stop and clear his throat at that part. The empire went on. Of course it went on. Empires do not dissolve because their masters learn to love. Sandro Moretti remained what he was, and the family remained what it was, gold and dangerous and endless, running its shadowed business beneath the shining city 2,000 miles away. There were still enemies. There were still nights he flew east, with his face gone cold and hard. Still calls he took out of Grace's hearing. Still the quiet men on the coast road, and the wall he kept strong between the darkness and the porch. She never pretended otherwise. She had made her peace with what she'd married. The darkness was real, and it was the price, and she paid it with clear eyes, because she had weighed it against the alternative, a life without him, and found the scale would never balance that way. But the centre of his world was no longer the tower. It never would be again. The centre of his world was a little white house at the lonely shore, with a garden that bloomed in impossible profusion, and a woman who said, "I love you," out loud, every single day, exactly as she'd promised, and a dark-eyed girl who grew, and then a second child, a son, born 2 years later, this time with Sandro's hand in Grace's, and no one else's needed, in the small hospital 2 towns over, the Don of the Moretti family, white-faced and useless and utterly transformed in the waiting, and then holding his son in the grey dawn and weeping without shame. On the evening this story truly ends, an ordinary evening, years on, no war, no threat, nothing but the long gold California dusk coming down over the water, Alessandro Moretti sat on the porch of the little white house with his wife beside him and his daughter chasing gulls along the shore below, and his infant son asleep against his chest. And Grace, watching him, saw him do the thing he did now without thinking, the thing that still, after everything, could stop her heart. He laid his free hand, very gently, over the small, warm weight of their sleeping son, as though checking that he was real, as though a man who had spent his whole life taking things could not quite believe he had been allowed, in the end, to keep something. He caught her watching, and the coldest man in New York, the Don of the Moretti family, the man whose name made hard men careful in 3 cities, smiled at his wife, softly, in the gold light, with no wall between them at all. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I have an empire," he said. He looked out at the sea, at his daughter chasing gulls, down at his sleeping son, and back at the woman he'd loved from the first tear, and that I'd trade every inch of it tonight without a second thought to keep exactly this. His hand tightened gently over their son. "This is the only thing I ever really wanted. It just took me half my life and a war to understand that what I was building the whole time wasn't an empire at all." He looked at her. It was a way home. The sun went down into the sea. The flowers she'd grown out of nothing nodded in the evening wind, and in the little white house at the lonely shore, the coldest of men laid his hand over his sleeping child, and his wife leaned her head against his shoulder, and the tide pulled back from the shore the way it always did, taking the last of the old sorrow with it, leaving behind only what had, against every odd, survived. The empire still stood. But what he most wanted to keep in the end was a home, and he had at last learned how.